Hello, and welcome to the Courtenay Turner podcast. My guest today is known as Escape Key on Substack. We usually don't do this where we're covert, but to respect his privacy, we have agreed to do this conversation, and he will be known as Escape Key, which is what his Substack handle is. And that's how we will refer to him. So we'll have a little picture up for viewing. But I'm super excited for this conversation. He has done some incredible investigation into the history of how we have gotten here to where we are today, with really what looks like they're setting up for a complete and total technocratic control grid. He had posted pretty recently, I guess it was August 12th, we are not facing a climate crisis. We are living through the final phase of decades-long deception designed to create global technocratic control under the banner of environmental protection. And I would very strongly agree with that statement. We're going to discuss going back almost a century. I would argue we could probably go back longer. We could possibly even go back millennia if we were to unpack some of the philosophical, arguably spiritual, theological frameworks that have led us to where we are today. But we're going to start with close to a century ago because there's just so much to unpack. And he's done a great job at really going through these documents from their own words, which I think is, as you know, if you've been a longtime listener or follower, my favorite way to do it. I know sometimes it's kind of boring and tedious, but I really appreciate giving you the source from the horse's mouth. So this way you know that it's not just my interpretation or analysis. This is literally what they say in their own words. They hide everything in plain sight. It's just that most of us have not read all of these documents because nobody possibly could. It's impossible to keep up with all of what they put forth. So we're gonna get right into it. Escape, how are you doing today?
Yeah, very good. Thank you very much. Thank you for the introduction. How are you doing?
I am doing well, thank you. Yeah, so I know we had talked about we had a loose timeline of where we wanted to go, and how we were going to start this off. And you were thinking that we might a good place to start would be with the NATO Committee of Three. But however you want to open it, maybe before we dive right in, give the audience who might not be as familiar with your work. I know a lot of my audience probably is familiar, but for those who aren't, a little bit of background. You don't have to share personal information, but just how you started diving into all of this and what made you look in this direction and why you started, reading their source material.
Sure. Well, at the beginning of um, COVID, much like a lot of other people, I knew something instinctively was wrong, and but it was very difficult to put a finger on exactly what the problem was. And a few years down the line, I just started looking into it, and before you know it, here I am.
Fair enough. Yeah. Well, you've done a great job of uncovering quite a bit pretty quickly. I always make the joke that I too woke up during that time period, and I always make the joke that I was completely asleep and I was looking for the train station. I found a high speed rail and I'm scrambling to catch up. So some of your work has been really helpful for that. So thank you. Yeah. So where do you want to start? Do you want to start with the NATO Committee of Three? And then we'll kind of go from there.
Well, sure. The NATO Committee of Three is. I suppose we should quickly revisit kind of the sort of clearinghouse
Yes.
structure, which came into being kind of by the London banks in the sort of 1790 to 1860 period of time. What they effectively did was concentrate power with the Bank of England, and this model effectively was developed and progressively placed into the Federal Reserve, followed by the Bank of International Settlements, and they all use this sort of model, which effectively placed the Bank of England or Federal Reserve, of course, at the very top, and then they would have um, you know uh, sort of clearing banks below them, which would deal with all the sort of small banks. And the way this would work would effectively be that like the smaller banks would deal with like a medium-sized bank, and they would sort of like clear out all the sort of transaction in between them, and then basically the sort of medium-sized banks kind of would then clear everything out with one another through the Bank of England.
And
And
they make
what this structure in effect,
hang on, I just want to clarify this. Do they make a percentage on those transactions as well? That's my understanding.
it's not. No, it's not really
Okay.
about basically, it's not really about making any percentages. It's about the control that comes along with it. Because basically about placing one organization at the very peak and having a sort of a hierarchical,
Mhm.
hierarchical sort of distribution of the various banks. Any bank which is above you can effectively sort of refuse to clear you. Now, imagine you're in the situation that you run a bank and every other bank they clear via the same structure. If you don't clear in that structure, you effectively kind of have got an enormous disadvantage from a competitive perspective. And that basically places kind of like the apex institution at an enormous advantage because basically at any point in time can refuse to clear basically a bank's trade, and consequently kind of what that in effect means kind of basically can put the man out of business with relative ease. And um, if we look a little bit forward, obviously everyone knows about Karl Marx, kind of basically about the Alexander Bogdanov sort of followed up with a lot of his work, kind of like, and sort of said that though he agreed with Marx in terms of a lot of these sort of things, one major sort of thing he disagreed with Marx in regards was that it wasn't the owner of the means of production that was the societal elite. The societal elite was effectively the administrator who would be sitting controlling kind of basically the sort of connections between the various industries, etc. Effectively, the politicians or the bureaucrat sitting in the middle. Because if you think about it logically, kind of you can own every single factory on the planet, but if the clearing institution effectively refuses you to trade, then it's no good, basically. And that was essentially Bogdanov's sort of crucial insight in this regard. And that's basically kind of the same thing as the London bank clearinghouses placing the Bank of England kind of basically at the apex sort of came to realize. And in 1956, what they in effect did basically with regards to, so 1955 was the Warsaw Pact kind of basically came to be, and in 1956, the Warsaw Pact, I mean, there's a little bit longer topic, but 1956 kind of basically NATO came, um, they drafted this report called the Committee of Three, and basically what it effectively said that NATO so far has only been concerned basically with military matters, but what we need to do is essentially for NATO also to start considering cultural, economic, political matters. So effectively kind of basically fusing military with non-military matters. And the way that effectively basically was to be done basically was by effectively what we call determinants, basically kind of later down the road. But it effectively basically kind of created a sort of quasi clearinghouse basically in that regard. And let me see. It effectively meant that basically what NATO did was that they redefined security beyond just military defense. And that effectively kind of basically was very much along the lines of the determinant sort of template, basically, where any domain kind of base, which is even loosely linked kind of base to the primary domain, as in military here, would effectively become part of NATO's sort of remit. And there was basically kind of the template, which was then rolled out continuously, kind of through the decades, which came to be. Like a quick example, basically, kind of would be, you look at the UNFCCC. Basically, they when they balance carbon sinks with carbon sources, kind of there has to be a middleman in the middle, kind of sitting balancing, the problem basically with the buyers versus the sellers, or whatever you'd like to say. It's effectively the installation kind of basically of a middleman in the process. I like to picture it in my mind as kind of basically a tug of war, kind of basically where there's a sort of a judge sit in the middle, just sitting at any point in time, just pulling a little bit in one side or another and calling it equity.
Right, right. Uh, Holding up the works and controlling the direction of things.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And from then, essentially, that developed through the RAND Corporation, kind of basically started looking into systems theory,
I'm
um, and that
I'm
obviously,
curious just
sorry,
before we move on with that. So, how many? I mean, the only clearinghouse in this country that I'm even familiar with is Seed and Co. Right, the Depository Trust and Clearing. That's the only one I'm familiar with
yeah.
in in the United States. But I don't know. Are they all interconnected? And how many? Do you know how many of them there are? And what is the relationship they have with each other?
it's more of a principle as opposed to an actual organization. But
Okay.
basically, yeah, Seed and Co is a great example. But Seed and Co effectively basically was what the Bank of England installed, kind of basically in the UK, more than almost 200 years ago. It's basically the same model. Seed and Co is a replication, kind of basically, kind of of that same model. And if we go back to that time, basically, kind of in 1892, there was a really, really important international monetary conference in Brussels. At that conference, Alfred de Rothschild was essentially singing the praises of the BOE model, kind of basically the clearinghouse structure, kind of which placed the Bank of England at the very top, at the apex. Um,
So
However, in 1890,
I'm so
so
sorry.
yeah,
I sorry to interrupt you again. So the Bank of England is at the apex. So were they above like the Bank of International Settlements and the central bankers? I would no, right?
the BIS didn't exist at that point in time. That's the thing.
Right,
Basically,
right. Okay.
in 1892, basically the Bank of England was basically, it was basically the first organization kind of basically showed this. Although, anyway, kind of basically for the time being, kind of let's just say that.
Sure.
But in 1892, so Alfred de Rothschild traveled to basically Brussels International Monetary Conference, and they said this our model is awesome, like kind of the best thing since sliced bread, right? But also in 1892, there was this Zurich academic by the name of Julius Wolff, and he basically kind of proposed scaling this structure kind of basically internationally, basically kind of where instead of so in those days, kind of basically they would be trading a lot of gold. So one central bank would be sending gold to another central bank, and obviously that would be enormously costly and also enormously risky because it might be stolen, etc.
Mm.
Um, so what Julius Wolff proposed at that point in time was instead of having this system basically where they send gold from one country to another, they need to have one basically with vaults that they all trust. And instead of then sending the gold itself, they would send gold certificates. They'll
Mhm.
clear out the gold between them, basically saying, "I buy this amount, I sell this amount." So the net volume is basically what I have to transfer to you. You have to transfer to me. But instead of transferring the actual gold, they'll just send gold certificates between the central banks, and that was, enormously beneficial. Basically, certainly, kind of for the organization at the apex. And basically, kind of when you speak about Seed and Co, that's basically the exact same model, just for equities.
Right.
But yeah,
And then
now the thing is basically with regards to Julius Wolff, the model, the structure that he proposed in 1892 was the one which was fused into the Bank for International Settlements upon its foundation in 1930. It's the exact same mechanism.
gotcha. And so do you know how many of these clearinghouses there are around the world? And do they I know you said they're not necessarily like a centralized locus, but they're it's more of a model. But do they have relationship with each other? Is there any kind of like yeah, how do they interact?
It's in this regard, it's more of a structure which can be
Okay.
applied basically for any purpose. So it's kind of like, it can be applied kind of basically regards to central banks offsetting relative to another. It can be basically applied here in military context, or it can be applied in, basically trading kind of carbon offsets. It's more just a principle basically of inserting a middleman into trading partners. I mean, think of the Frankfurt School critical theory, kind of basically, kind of, not so much what they claim to do, but when you actually investigate and see what they actually do, is basically they create an oppressor versus oppressed. But what they don't say anything about is essentially they create a nice cushy little job for an expert mediator to sit there forever in the
Right.
center to, supposedly kind of balance these tensions.
Right.
It's basically a bit of a scam, kind of basically kind of get a smooth talking operation for you to accept that there has to be an expert panel sitting in the middle to mediate because it's good for you.
Right,
Um,
for sure. Um, yeah, so that's very interesting because I'm not super familiar with the how they operate the clearinghouses, but we don't have to get into it now. But I suspect that they, if we transitioned everything into a tokenized kind of a system, that would give them even more power. We don't, you can elaborate, or we can get to it later, whatever you prefer.
yeah, it's merely just that they're the ones sitting in the middle
Mhm.
of all trades, and basically deciding kind of which trades go ahead and which trades do not go ahead.
Right.
And that gives you an enormous amount of power. I mean, another good example of a clearinghouse was essentially in 1974, when the global environmental monitoring system, basically arguably the first global surveillance system on the planet, was set up. They were created at the same point in time as Infoterra. I think it was called the International Referral System initially, but Infoterra later. Basically, what they were an information clearinghouse, and basically what that means is essentially that they're a middleman sitting in the middle, determining what information should you see and what information should be filtered back.
Right.
It's just a manipulative way of inserting sort of a judge in the middle, kind of basically of oppressor versus oppressed dynamic.
Right.
It's very clever.
Very clever. Yeah, very clever. Okay, sorry, I didn't mean to detour, but, I'm guessing other people might have had that question as well, so go on.
No problem.
So, yes, okay, so where from there, you said that was in, so so then in 1930, they set up the Bank of International Settlements.
Yeah, so the BIS came to be basically in 1930. Now, the Committee of Three was in 1956,
56.
and then there was followed basically by RAND, which basically began really investigating kind of systems theory and PPBS, which was essentially instituted by McNamara in 1961, basically when he became the Department of Defense was secretary under JFK.
Mhm.
And what PPBS is effectively is saying kind of we have a number of inputs, as in we need money, we need equipment, whatever kind of basically, and what is the outputs we're going to get from this, and it's the sort of entire sort of process of planning and you know, planning, programming, budgeting kind of basically kind of it's effectively creating what they call the program elements, where they could effectively claim to predict what would be the outcome of a certain operation, because based by doing that, you can then structure them basically not one but two but three, and even combine three into become a sort of super program element, and that effectively means kind of as you they claim to be able to predict the future, or rather plan the future. I
Yeah.
mean, it doesn't necessarily work very well, kind of, but that's the idea of it. It's sort of yeah, it's kind of quite Spinozian, basically, if you think about it. But
It's where we get the
the point is
Delphi
then
method. I just wrote an article, The Algorithmic Oracle, and the Delphi method kind of takes a sensitivity training and mechanizes it into like a formula for manufacturing consent through polling and surveys. Yeah, and it was under the auspices of needing to evaluate the efficacy of technology in wartime. But of course, it's really more about planning and programming the consensual outcomes.
the thing is basically so PPBS basically as said was instituted by Robert McNamara kind of basically in 1961. At that point in time, basically essentially of the CIA, the sort of forgotten man, Robert Amory Jr., who was the director of intelligence, also investigated its use kind of basically for intelligence. Now, one of the key aspects of PPBS is that it relies on input output analysis. So as said, basically, if you got certain inputs, you get certain outputs. Basically, kind of once you process the information or data or whatever, right? Now, in order to be able to run an efficient input-output analysis in the first place, kind of basically, you need pretty heavy surveillance. You need to know exactly kind of basically what works, what doesn't work, and you need to understand kind of basically kind of if something gets lost,
Right.
what exactly went wrong, and kind of how can we compensate for that. So consequently, kind of basically that in effect, the institution of PPPS basically demands quite a substantial amount of surveillance information. Now, so what took place was that obviously the Bay of Pigs was a monumental disaster. Um, and because this, JFK decided to basically sack everyone, all the senior officers, kind of basically of the CIA. Now, what no one was quite expecting was that Robert Amory kind of basically would be sacked as well. Basically, they were trying to protect him, but basically, when you really dive into the archives, I mean, he was part of it as well. Um, he was definitely sort of a member, sort of that lot, kind of basically, and so they got rid of him. um, and that potentially kind of postponed kind of basically the installation of PPBS through government, which effectively took place in 1965. But when you read up on the entire sort of timeline, kind of get it, I've gone into depths with this basically on Substack. Kind of basically, I've written 4 articles about it. Kind of could easily occupy hours of your time, basically in this regard. But there's some significant substantial evidence, circumstantial evidence, which would suggest kind of basically this would definitely have been a motivating sort of influence with regards to getting rid of JFK, basically because what happened in 1962 with regards to the Cuban Missile Crisis was that the sort of automated systems of McNamara basically was basically saying do strategic bombing of Cuba. And there would have been an absolute disaster because basically kind of the Soviet installations basically on Cuba were far more advanced than they thought. And it could theoretically have led to nuclear war kind of basically very quickly. But JFK basically shot down the idea, and he basically I think he made a couple of speeches about human intuition and stuff like that, how they will always be superior to, pure analytics, basically kind of computers. And basically kind of that effectively led to sort of a trajectory kind of basically where he started getting rid of kind of basically people who are involved in this. And with the direct result that kind of basically by getting rid of JFK, kind of basically what was actually kind of a huge of huge benefit to those people who wanted PPBS to go through, kind of basically, kind of, and in 1964, kind of basically, what's his name? David Rockefeller went to Moscow, and very strangely, pretty much immediately after Khrushchev was ousted, kind of basically, and Brezhnev and Kosygin came to power, basically in Soviet Union, and it was Alexei Kosygin, I think his name is, kind of basically he instituted effectively a system called OGAS, OGAS, basically, which was very, very similar to PPBS at the same point in time, and it's this really interesting thing because at the point in time when the Soviet Union instituted OGAS, basically, was exactly the same point in time that um, um, Lyndon B. Johnson instituted PPBS throughout the government. And that was basically kind of, that came to be basically kind of roughly around the same time as Lyndon B. Johnson's Great Society. And what the Great Society essentially kind of was a big war on, on poverty kind of based. But when you actually read the final detail, it's effectively kind of a future governance by indicators sort of scheme, where essentially kind of you can sort of quickly determine these people kind of basically have got more than other people. Consequently, we need to fix this. And that's fundamentally kind of what this is all about. It's all about kind of creating a blanket of information which is so severe and so enormous, kind of basically in detail that kind of basically at any point in time they think they can address any underlying problem. And that's basically indicator governance, which I've spoken of, I address quite a bit of my Substack.
Sure. You know,
Sorry, that's a bit of a rant.
what? Yeah, yeah. No, there was a lot in there. Um, so from there, what do you feel like was they were setting up?
Well, this is the thing because so this was in 1965, and in 1966 there was a huge sudden drive from multiple angles, kind of basically in relation to Spaceship Earth. You had Barbara Ward, who basically kind of addressed Spaceship Earth, basically kind of from the sort of environmental aspect. But the far more interesting character was Kenneth Boulding. Exactly. That is one of the most important sort of documents, probably kind of from that period of time, because what that in effect addresses is general systems theory from the perspective of being a closed system. So basically, kind of when you have these models, kind of basically, kind of I like to sort of think of blood running through your body, right? Kind of basically, you have a number of veins in your body, of course. Input output analysis effectively kind of basically will tell you kind of basically where the blood is running, right? So you have basically essentially a sensor kind of any point in time in your body, it will tell you this amount of blood kind of goes here and goes there, yada yada. And the general systems theory component is essentially a description of the veins themselves. So once you have essentially a description of the veins and you have a description of essentially the blood flow, the idea is essentially then you can basically manipulate the blood flow, which is what cybernetics is.
I was just gonna say,
And then
yeah.
basic
Okay.
and then when you have that full understanding, kind of basically, you can adjust kind of basically your body in terms of cybernetically kind of modify kind of basically the blood sent around your body, kind of basically, then you can step to the next sort of step, which is basically it's into resilience, to make sure that basically kind of you can balance the body kind of basically through artificially, effectively take control of the body, if nothing else. Again, I mean, this is obviously sort of a highly theoretical, sort
Yeah.
of idealized sort of perspective, but basically that's fundamentally kind of what general systems theory, input output analysis, and you know, um, cybernetics, etc. That's fundamentally what it is.
Well, I think it's a really important
But
point. I just want to drive that home for the audience is that it is theoretical. Because I think that the way that a lot of these so-called experts approach it is that this is kind of it's factual and that it's rooted in reality, which it's not. I mean, it gives you some indication of, but it's a model, it's a theory. So I think
it's
that's
it's it's fundamentally impossible to do what they do, because basically, kind of like, basically just a milliliter of blood contains exactly how many particles, kind of basically how many atoms. I mean, there's no way you can model all this stuff.
right.
It's the quantity of information is so high that it's just pure fantasy that you can model it. It's the same thing with climate science. Kind of basically, there's no way you can model 30 years in advance. Kind of basically with this, it's just lunatic fantasy, right?
Yes.
But but anyway, kind of basically I said so. Just to go back, kind of basically with regards to general systems theory.
Yeah.
So general systems theory was originally Ludwig van Bertalanffy, I think his name is, and he basically proposed sort of a network topology where effectively, like, you got your friends and they got friends and they got friends, yada yada, kind of basically create sort of a mesh network where everyone is sort of connected, but there's no fundamental sort of structure. It's just everyone is sort of connected to everyone else through 6 degrees or whatever you want to say. And what sorry, what Boulding addressed in his 1956 um, Kenneth Boulding in 1956 basically wrote an article, a paper called Skeleton of Science. And it was basically a general systems theory, but what he said is like, no, what we have to do is basically, we cannot have it just a sort of network topology, kind of based with all these nodes connected loosely to another. We need to actually kind of create a hierarchical structure to this, which again, you can then equate kind of it to the clearinghouse, because you just have a standard hierarchy, and the hierarchy node, which is above any other node, will effectively control the nodes below it. Kind of basically, it's fundamentally the same thing. Um, Now, the thing is, in 1966, when Boulding published kind of basically the economics of becoming Spaceship Earth, not only did he try again basically kind of Spaceship Earth itself, but he did it in context of general systems theory. Now, he basically kind of flipped the script, so to speak, on what Bertalanffy or whatever had done, basically by saying, no, it's not an open model. This is a closed model, as in kind of basically, we know every single node in this system, this will effectively end up with itself. So think of kind of basically your bloods, your veins and your blood, right?
Mhm.
That's a closed system, because essentially, if there's an open system, kind of basically, then the blood would just spill
Right.
somewhere and you die.
Yeah.
But basically, kind of, so what he in fact said was that Spaceship Earth was a highly connected mesh of nodes, which effectively kind of is in a complete loop. And because everything is in a complete loop, basically we can effectively kind of control Spaceship Earth. And it also means that we can measure the flow of any resource, which is where basically the circular economy is effectively exactly that. The circular economy is essentially the measuring of sort of materials as they flow kind of through the sort of earth, so to speak.
Sure.
And yeah, that was later developed kind of basically through Courtenay Turner in, I think it's 1989, kind of basic. But yeah, basically, if you read that paper, it's one of the most fundamental, basically, regards to understanding kind of basically kind of what's truly happening. Kind of that paper came in 1966, and um, after that, basically, kind of after that, kind of we have quite possibly the most important conference to ever take place in Paris in 1968, which was the UNESCO Biosphere Conference.
Mhm.
And I mean, essentially, it's got 20 recommendations in there, and it is just stunning. It is absolutely stunning. It's kind of like it's just one of those. It's one of those reports where I've gone back to like kind of 4 or 5 times, and I keep digging up stuff because it's just epic. And it doesn't just basically speak of kind of basically having future global environmental monitoring, but it in details addresses what should be measured, and that all um, the way we should measure everything should be standardized, and our communications network should be standardized. It speaks about kind of basically the education of teachers, and kind of the various different groups, kind of basically how they should receive information, the educational information, and recommendation. Sorry, hang on. Recommendation three alone, kind of basically, if you can find that, kind of basically find recommendation three because it is absolutely spectacular. What it in effect says is that in 3.3 is one of the most interesting lines, kind of basically, which is in One Health documents contemporarily, right there, yeah. It says basically the establishment of the necessary balance between man and his environment in relation to the maintenance of his health and well-being in the broadest connotations. And you pull up kind of basically the pandemic treaty and One Health, and that's exactly almost word for word what they still say. Now, if you go back to 3.2, if you scroll a little bit down there, yeah, basically what it says there was special reference to those associated, kind of basically undertaken on the ecology and human diseases, with special reference to those associated with environmental change and to the zoonotic diseases arising from interactions between man and animals. Well, there you go. I mean, kind of essentially, kind of what more do you need? It's like kind of you got One Health, you got COVID, which is supposedly a zoonotic disease, and the other interesting thing is essentially in 1968, kind of basically, there was I think it was called the Hong Kong bars or whatever. I forget, right? I mean, it's all made up, right? I actually dug into the original records, basically, in regards to the numbers, and the influenza at that point in time was a little bit marginally worse than surrounding years. But it's been continuously revised upwards in later years to make it appear as if it was a big deal. When the reality situation is, when you go in and investigate the what do they call MMWR reports or whatever at the time, basically we're just saying it's about 25% worse than surrounding years. It really wasn't that major a deal, basically. But yeah, so many things were spawned with that report. It just beggars belief. It is absolutely spectacular, kind of based that report.
Wow.
And obviously 1968 is also the year based where the Club of Rome kind of basically was launched, which has been a hint in itself.
Right, and it was also I'm trying to find it right now, I'm not finding it, but it was also, there was a document, it was called, the Guiding Images of Man and Future, and it was, Willis Harman. It was published through the Education Policy Research, a unifying focus, it was so Stanford Research Institute, um, and, along with EPRC, but this was sponsored by the Office of Education Bureau of Research, and this was like, I guess it was the precursor, to the Changing Images of Man document, which, of course, really is about changing man's consciousness and perception of himself, right? Which they needed to do in order to move us into this kind of a collectivist kind of a mindset, right? They talk about moving us out of the age of Pisces into the age of Aquarius. And, Pisces all focused on the individual, the age of Aquarius is all the collective, and yeah, all of that. Interestingly enough, because you were bringing up the closed systems versus open systems, and of course, when you talk about the age of Aquarius, Chardin comes to the forefront. This whole concept of the noosphere, which various different movements have different names for, but essentially it's all the same thing. But then there was Vernadsky, who claims to be the so a lot of people have claimed that Vernadsky was like a closed system and Chardin is an open system. uh, I'm curious your thoughts on it from a systems theory perspective, because to me, they seem to funnel into the same place. It doesn't really, I don't think one is superior to the other.
Well, from my perspective, Talhart kind of basically kind of was the spiritual reflection, kind of basically of Vernadsky's materialist sort of focus.
Mhm.
And I mean, the two of them basically knew each other, kind of basically from the early 1920s.
Yeah, they
So
both
it's
had the same
it's
mentor
it's
who taught them about this concept. I forgot his name.
yeah, but they're also in I think it was 1920. 21 or 22, basically, they essentially met and cooperated kind of basically in
Mhm.
France. So it's kind of like, they knew each other.
Yeah.
Without a shadow of a doubt, they knew each other. So it's not really beyond
And
the realms of
collaborated. They didn't just know each
imagination.
other, they
Yeah,
collaborated with each
yeah.
other. Yeah.
They started speaking of the noosphere, kind of basically, kind of in relative succession. Kind of basically essentially sort of what the collective sort of thought of humanity, basically, so to speak, kind of basically. But yeah, I mean, essentially, they're obviously kind of basically, sort of pulled. What they like to do, kind of very frequently, is essentially kind of they take any sort of given task, and you need to make people sort of do X or understand Y, kind of basically, but you can't just admit it. So they take it and you split it up into small bits, kind of basically, kind of need to pass them individual, and that's quite clearly what they did. But yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Alright, so
But we can carry on with
okay.
basically the Moynihan memo, which was basically what we spoke about earlier, kind of
Mhm.
basically. And so in 1969, kind of basically, sort of there's this September 17, 1969, kind of there's this Moynihan memo going out, and it was basically kind of like sort of secret. It wasn't declassified until about a year ago, kind of basically. And about a year ago, kind of like all the mainstream media, like, they started running it. Kind of basically, it's great that you sort of show the top half here, right? Because this is what the mainstream media kind of did, right? So the mainstream media effectively sort of said carbon dioxide kind of basically is this, well, it's really terrifying, and perhaps New York City kind of basically will be under 6 feet of water, or whatever. Basically by the year 25%, it's like kind of basically now pretty clearly agreed that the CO2 content will rise 25% based on 2000. This could increase the average temperature near the Earth's surface by 7 degrees Fahrenheit. This in turn could raise the level of the sea by 10 feet. Goodbye, New York, etc. Right? So you get this like absurd alarmism right now. The mainstream media, basically, as retarded as it is, and corrupt and fraudulent, basically they've run it on the premise that kind of, oh, they knew about carbon dioxide. And if you just read this top half of this memo, kind of basically kind of fine, okay, yeah, it does warn about this. I mean, there's a little bit more to it, because this ultimately traces back to the 1963 Conservation Foundation first, sort of um, the Conservation Foundation was this sort of Rockefeller-funded foundation, kind of basically, and in 1963 they constituted the first sort of carbon consensus. And the report is hilarious because they knew absolutely nothing, right? They knew literally nothing, and yet at the same point in time they came up with this conclusion that CO2 was definitely bad for us, and that's basically what this traces back to. Now, if you go down to the bottom half of this. It pretty much follows by saying it is entirely possible that there will be countervailing effects. For example, blah, 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 right? In other words, what they basically say in this document is that we have no idea. We have literally no idea, basically, what impact CO2 has on the environment. But if you look at the next section after that, in any event, I would think that this is a subject that the administration ought to get involved in. It is natural for NATO. Perhaps the first order of business is to begin a worldwide monitoring system. Yeah, okay. How come basically it wasn't run on that headline? How come how come the mainstream media didn't sort of tell everyone kind of, oh yeah, NATO is to run global surveillance on the planet, and this was like in 1969.
Well, and this is
It's just backers belief.
I
So yeah,
mean, this is really an extension of the vision that the Technocracy Inc. had, back in the 1930s, right? They talked about energy
yeah.
credits. I mean, energy credits are really what these, carbon credits are, today, what they're talking about, carbon credits, it's the same thing, energy credits that they talked about how they would have to surveil, in order they would have to create, like, a monitoring system in order to control people. Because after all, technocracy is a science of social engineering. That's exactly what they said it was.
I agree with you. Basically, kind of gets it's the inverse, effectively, kind of basically. Yes, I agree with you, kind of basically, but it's 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 only as so far they could eliminate nuclear energy. Basically, nuclear energy sort of changed that spectrum, the idea, because basically, kind of as right you are, kind of basically, they had the energy certificate in 1936, kind of basically, and obviously, the inverse energy certificate without nuclear is effectively the burning of fossil fuels. And the positive, basically, in that regard, is essentially if you can measure kind of the carbon dioxide levels, then yes, you can effectively measure kind of basically the amount of carbon dioxide being used. I mean, you can't actually in reality, because in actual reality, we have no idea kind of basically kind of how large a quantity of carbon dioxide is sucked up by the oceans basically every single year. Kind of basically, it involves an enormous amount of factors which we absolutely cannot model. And basically, kind of up until about the year 2000, we didn't even have any information really, basically, in regards to just like kind of content, basically, of carbon dioxide in the world's oceans. It's
Right.
just all lunatic fantasy. This.
And when they say that we don't know the effects in this document, I mean, we actually do. We know that CO2 is a life molecule. We do know that
Yeah,
there's a direct
plant food.
correlation to like the greenery of the world, which is what breeds
Yes.
life. So yeah.
Yeah, and it's funny because basically Bert Bolin basically was probably the primary voice kind of based on all this climate alarmism in the 70s. In 1976, stood in front of the House of Congress, kind of basically and delivered basic remarks where he said that basically the last person to make predictions in regards to the future climate would be a climate scientist. Essentially, he said basically kind of sure, kind of carbon dioxide is essentially a sponge with basically kind of however personally I'm worried about it, right? That was basically the extent of his remarks. And yet, in spite of this, in 1975, the year before, UNESCO at the Belgrade Charter kind of basically they determined that we need to start educating everyone about environmentalism kind of basically, and we need to basically start fusing a global ethic relating to the to environments into the curriculum. I mean, it cannot be real. It's so obviously fraudulent. But yeah,
Yes,
it's
the sophistry is pretty transparent. Yes.
but
And
basically, if we can go from the Moynihan memo because this is actually a really interesting time. So in
yeah.
so in 1969, kind of basically, kind of with the Moynihan memo, obviously, um, there's some tension here because basically the Soviet Union cannot basically be seen to cooperate kind of basically with anything involving NATO, basically regards to global monitoring, kind of basically of the planet, kind of basically center. So there's the International Council of Scientific Unions, ICSU, in 1969 set up SCOPE, basically, which is Scientific Committee on Problems of the Environment, and they basically manufactured the sort of system, kind of basically to perform global monitoring, global surveillance, but they also down the line fabricated basically all the global warming nonsense, right? But in 1971, kind of basically were commissioned their first report by Maurice Strong as an input for the 1972 Stockholm meeting, which generated, United Nations Environment Program. And basically, kind of what they were tasked with doing was basically write a report, kind of essentially kind of with global surveillance. And you read the first basic scope one report, kind of basically, and it's impressive, and I think it's only about 60 or 70 pages. Basically, kind of gets it's the first report, but it's still pretty good. So obviously, kind of basically in 1972, basically kind of we had in Stockholm we had basically that meet, and in 1973, kind of basically Maurice Strong then comes back and sort of says, sure, kind of basically now write us an implementation plan. Scope 3 basically was the result global environment monitoring system. Kind of basically, I think that's the first one you got right there. But but the third one kind of basically is just, you read it and it is just chock full of detail. And one of the more interesting parts is I think it's chapter 12, which starts diving into detail basically in regards to kind of basically what sort of additional information that they need basically in regards to monitoring. Because it goes into detail basically about socio-economic factors, which is basically the sort of future social determinants of health and all that sort of stuff. But it also details basically public health surveillance, which obviously has absolutely nothing to do with essentially if you're trying to keep basically the planet itself healthy. Kind of basically all of a sudden going into detail and asking kind of basically for public health surveillance be a little bit of a aggressive sort of move, right? Now in 1974, they're sitting talking to all the other members basically of UNEP, so as in country representatives, and they're sitting talking about this kind of basically, and I think it's sort of the Western sort of contributors are pushing really aggressively for stuff like public health surveillance, and a lot of the people kind of basically from second and third world are like what the hell is going on here? Because this has got nothing to do with the original sort of remit of it. And you can read some of the early reports kind of basically essentially, and they're basically kind of smelling a rat. And all of a sudden that just sort of disappears, kind of basically no one talks about it ever again. And it's interesting. But another thing which is interesting is since that 1973 report, Scope 3 Global Environment Monitoring System, when you compare that kind of basically to what was effectively spoken about kind of basically at the 1979 First World Climate Conference, it's practically identical. I mean, it's kind of in 1973, they had this report which was absolutely perfect to the extent that they in 1979 could basically kind of take the next step forward basically on that account. I mean, it just beggars belief. They knew what they were doing, kind of basically. They had the objective kind of basically before them. They're just sitting structuring together. We knew kind of basically what the objective was, and they're talking about kind of basically essentially, how do we do this? They weren't really trying to address any real issues. They're trying to create kind of a comprehensive global surveillance. It wasn't about the kind of basically saving the planet. It was about kind of a sense of them just being control freaks, so to speak. But sorry, but the entire early '70s kind of basically was really an interesting period of time because basically kind of in relatively short succession, kind of basically we had the Stockholm conference. I think it was in June or July, kind of basically. But in May, towards the end of May, kind of basically, we had the SALT agreements, which was nuclear treaty between the United States and Soviet Union, right? Kind of basically, and those discussions were had, as far as I recall, between the 24th and 30th. They made all the noise in the media. No one was talking about anything else but SALT and basically the Stockholm meeting. Immediately before, on the 23rd of May, 1972, you have the Corporation on Environmental Protection, kind of basically, kind of what that document is basically, from our perspective. I could be wrong, kind of basically, but my take on this is essentially kind of it's treason. Basically, that's what it is. What the document says, it's only 6 pages, it's fairly short. Basically, it says that kind of United States and Soviet Union should come together in order to generate all this sort of surveillance data, kind of basically, and in order to sort of determine kind of basically kind of what sort of negative impacts kind of basically environmental sort of problems are having on the planet, and kind of basically on that account basically they need to output policy advice which should then be implemented in the Soviet Union and the United States at the same point in time. That's essentially kind of the root of the technocracy right there. Kind of basically they're talking about kind of basically can create common policy between the Soviet Union and essentially the West at this point in time. Now, in order to do this, they obviously needed kind of basically what is effectively called global modeling. So you have all the surveillance information. You need to stuff it into general systems theory model, kind of basically need to forward predict it in order to determine what's going to happen tomorrow. That's basically kind of the idea of it.
Right.
And to that extent, they generate the International Institute of Applied Systems Analysis, the IIASA, which effectively became the foundation for the IPCC and a number of other these technocratic institutions down the line.
Right.
But yeah, and then of course you had the limits to growth report, which effectively kind of was the sales technique kind of for all this. It's an interesting page you got up there, right? Kind of because if you scroll a little bit, actually kind of right there, you can see basically 1966, Lyndon B. Johnson basically gave a really, really strange speech about kind of basically since they needed to cooperate closer, kind of basically with the Soviet Union. Now, this is at the height of the alleged sort of Cold War.
Cold War.
And here he is. Yeah, here he is basically sitting talking about closer cooperation kind of 6 years before kind of basically IISA came to be. It's, I mean, they clearly had a plan. And in order for ISA basically to model the future sort of, black box model, which are, basically cannot predict what they claim to be predicting. Basically, they needed to have the surveillance information, and kind of basically the surveillance information had other requirements. And kind of the political requirement was basically for the United States, Soviet Union to cooperate. And in order for that to take place, kind of basically they needed PPBS and OGAS basically kind of implemented in the United States and the Soviet Union. In order for that to come to be, they had to get rid of John F. Kennedy. That's basically kind of the sort of chronology.
Wow. And
'Cause
meanwhile, they're doing all this social cultural engineering behind the scenes too. We have the counterculture
yeah,
movement, and I always point to the CIA. What was it? The hot tub diplomacy document, where they basically say like sex, drugs, and rock and roll are gonna heal the world. But
yeah.
it was a diplomacy document between the Soviet Union and the United States. So they were very much working together and collaborating, despite the ostensible war, quote unquote, Cold War that we were under, where we were at
there,
odds with each other.
there was a lot of rhetoric basically kind of on this, and the thing is, so basically, kind of a while back, I wrote a report or wrote an essay on Substack called "The Missing Link," which goes through what little available evidence there is in regards to this entire sort of period of time and the narratives kind of based with regards to climate and stuff like that. And towards the end of it, I put together kind of a list of 15 questions, kind of obviously pointed questions, basically kind of, but I mean, there's no way this is legit. I mean, for instance, basically, so one of the key people in the Soviet Union was this chap called Yuri Israel. And Yuri Israel kind of basically was well aware, kind of basically, of all the climate disaster taking place basically in the Soviet Union at the point in time. Yet, in spite of this, in 1992, he became basically a senior at the IPCC, who lauded his credentials, kind of basically, which is like the guy was basically kind of like at the head of monumental environmental destruction, and here he is basically at the IPCC, being lauded. It makes no sense, kind of basically. But if you look at that document, sorry, that essay, if you scroll about 2/3 to 3/4 down, basically, since I said I've got 15 questions
Sure.
in a row, kind of based. And one of the things is essentially kind of which I dug up in one of the documents, basically, which just makes no sense whatsoever, is that essentially, supposedly at this point in time, there was a sulfur plume covering the entire western part of the Soviet Union at that point in time. But the IIASA at that point in time basically did a lot of modeling with regards to acid lakes and all that sort of stuff in Sweden and Norway, kind of basically, and they claimed there was West German and other Western sort of emitters, kind of basically sends a sulfur dioxide, and the reality of the situation, if there was a plume anywhere near that large, there would be no way in a trillion years for it not to affect kind of business into the northern Scandinavia. And yet the IIASA didn't even consider it. It's so obviously fraudulent. It's but I mean, essentially, kind of the entire sort of timeline is just absurd. Kind of, but like I said, about two thirds of the way down, kind of basically, I've just compiled that list because there's just no way it's legit. Yeah, exactly. That's the list. It's just all those kind of basically kind of questions come straight out of their own material, kind of basically. And I mean, I tend to fully source everything I do, just because otherwise you always get that person. Oh yeah, this is not real,
Mhm.
kind of basically, and to be
Right.
quite honest with you, it's also very convenient, basically, when you need to find a quote. Kind of, if you have fully sourced it, takes a little bit of extra time, basically, but it's just better that way. Um, but yeah, basically, kind of, yeah, there's another one. Like, kind of, it's why did Moisev kind of basically? So Nikita Moisev was one of the seniors from the Soviet side, basically, of the IIASA. He knew in, I think it was 1977. He knew that they could not forward predict kind of basically the climate. Yet he persisted. Why do you think that is? I mean, it's so obvious about control. But yeah,
Obviously. Well, and then, I know we
yeah,
talked about this before too, but I think I have the quote, actually, I think I did pull it up. The, Club of Rome, I mean, it is much later, it's the Global Revolution document, but they explicitly say that, they created this whole propaganda, and I'll find the quote just to read it for the audience. Yeah, they say here, uh the common enemy of humanity is man. In searching for a common enemy against whom we can unite, we came up with the idea that pollution, the threat of global warming, water shortages, famine, and the like would fit the bill. In their totality and their interactions, these phenomena do constitute a common threat, which must be confronted by everyone together. But in designing these dangers as the enemy, we fall into the trap which we have already warned the readers about, namely mistaking symptoms for causes. All these dangers are caused by human intervention in natural processes, and it is only through changed attitudes and behavior that they can be overcome. The real enemy, then, is humanity itself. I mean, they
yeah,
say it right there, and that's where they tie the two,
yeah,
right? This is where you get the policy and all of this junk science that they're fabricating, and then all this social engineering they're doing on the other side with the, ethics and, the collectivism. Yeah, I mean, they say it right there.
yeah. But so essentially, kind of, there's also I don't know if you looked heavily into the World Federalist sort of movement, kind of, but like
Little
essentially
bit.
there are two characters. So Saul Mendelowitz and Richard A. Falk, kind of basically were quite active basically in that regard. So 1971, Richard A. Falk wrote this book called An Endangered Planet, I think it's called. But anyway, kind of basically he discusses what are we going to use basically, what are the four potential angles kind of basically we can push through ideas about basically since of the sort of world orders models project, which is basically collectivism. And but anyway, kind of basically since in that he basically discussed as the fourth option, kind of basically environmentalism. But basically, kind of, one of the comments he leaves is essentially he's not quite sure basically since that is a strong enough message for it to actually kind of do the job. Basically, it's just sort of like yeah, this is probably not real. And then, of course, kind of basically 1970s, the World Economic Forum basically was founded, and the Trilateral Commission kind of basically also came to be basically at this point in time. And essentially, kind of they all sort of work together quite beautifully. Kind of basically these institutions, basically the World Economic Forum, basically essentially is the sort of the private sort of basically partners basically being represented, and the Trilateral sort of Commission is essentially kind of the sort of organization which facilitates the meetings between the public, private, and the NGOs, kind of basically, which are effectively the fake fronts, kind of basically kind of the NGOs are all funded kind of by Rockefeller, Gates, etc. Kind of
Exactly.
obviously kind of obviously just like doing whatever kind of basically the foundations are telling them to. But yeah, but I mean, it said kind of basically in that after that kind of we have the Belgrade Charter basically in 1975, which is discussing sort of environmental education at a point in time basically we had no idea kind of basically where the temperatures were going up and down. And in 1975, also kind of basically had a Newsweek article kind of basically about the cooling world, and these were actually senior sort of members of NOAA. They're not, you speak to people these days, and they're kind of like, "Oh no, no," but there are nobody. So I kind of saying this, no, no, this is real. Kind of basically, these were senior members of the NOAA saying kind of basically the temperatures might drop. And then also in 1975, which gives it all away, it's essentially the very first paper, kind of basically, or the very first serious paper, kind of basically on the pricing of carbon, kind of basically, and it was published by the IIASA. Right, 3 years after its founding, it suddenly kind of creates basically a paper on, yeah, we need to price carbon. And then 1977, I think, kind of basically sent to the EPA, Clean Air Act sort of amendment to 1977, sort of pushed through kind of carbon offsetting, and off you go. But yeah, I wrote basically a Substack article called basically Climate Chronology, which basically kind of goes one of those sort of things that just every single time I found something on climate narrative, I would just stuff it in there
Oh,
for my own
great.
personal reference. And then kind of basically eventually I sort of finished it off and published it. But when you read that through, especially the 60s and 70s, it's just so, I mean, it's just one thing after another, kind of basically. It just cannot be real. And in 1976, of course, you also had, Habitat, which basically began discussing getting rid of private land ownership, in effect. It's just one thing after another. But yeah, there are a couple of things from that list. I said in 1976, Berlin basically was standing in front of Congress saying, kind of, basically, we don't know anything about the carbon cycle, effectively. But in 1978, in a working group for the IIASA, basically, they effectively sort of said that kind of basically kind of our own confidence in our confidence in our own models is substantially below where they were 10 years ago. As in, by 1978, they knew a lot less about kind of basically the carbon cycle, kind of basically than they thought they did 10 years before. In other words, they had no idea, basically, and they knew it, right? And yet, about 6 months later, at the first climate conference, kind of basically kind of in Geneva, they suddenly basically kind of implied that kind of oh, carbon dioxide is a problem. It's it's just all it's pure fantasy. And the thing is essentially the thing about the first climate conference basically was that it was foundation funded, organized by the ICSU, basically, and no serious researcher with an alternate point of view, kind of basically, were invited. It was a closed event, and yet at the same point in time, people treat it as if kind of basically it carries any kind of weight. When the reality is essentially kind of the only people they invited were the people who were in on it, kind of basically, and they issued this ludicrous documents. But yeah, and then kind of basically we had the 3 Mile Island, incident basically immediately after, kind of which was just interesting because they had only just published kind of basically a nugget file, right, which was like this document chock full of kind of basically non-incidents, kind of basically nuclear industry, and then a couple months later, kind of we have the 3 Mile Island issue, basically sense of which was just like this really strange set of coincidences, and that obviously tapered in interest basically in building nuclear, which feeds into technocracy, as you were talking about before. They
Yeah.
had to get rid of nuclear basically in order to push this through.
Right, right. Which also funnels into all of the UN agendas with their uh, what do they call it? I'm totally blanking the something 2000 plan. It's like with the disarmament 2000 plan, right? Are you?
I think I know the one you're talking about. I forget.
I know I'm totally blanking on the name. I want to say like Armageddon, but that's not what it is. But it's a UN 2000 plan. For it's a disarmament plan. disarmament plan. Let me see if I can find it. UN 2000 disarmament. But I don't know what it's called. Oh, the abolition. That's what I thought it started with an A. Yeah, abolition 2000 global network to eliminate nuclear weapons. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's interesting if you actually read up on this point in time. So around this point in time, basically, Union of Concerned Scientists
Yes.
come to be, right?
Yes.
And basically, they say basically if you go to the web page, oh, they've always been pro, basically nuclear, nuclear energy. But if you go back kind of basically kind of through the Wayback Archives and stuff like that, and it's incredible how well they've been scrubbed because there are only a few documents left. Kind of basically, but there are a few documents which
Wow.
basically, without the shadow of a doubt, state that they are basically completely against nuclear and they're trying to shut down the nuclear basic industry in the United States. Basically, kind of later sort of documents basically sort of they claim they're pro-nuclear. They were always anti-nuclear in the early days. And Union of Concerned Scientists were also the very same group who, at the 1992, basically, they issued these 1,700 Nobel Prize winners and yada yada yada. Kind of basically kind of come out and sort of say we only have one or a few basically kind of decades before climate disasters. They're reversible. But these were Nobel Prize winners in 1992, standing kind of putting their name kind of basically on this document, saying that kind of we have just like 10, 20, possibly 30 years before it's game over. It's like here we are. We're still 12 years away. It's
Yeah,
it's
that
uh
they keep
it's
moving
pure fantasy.
the goalpost. Yeah.
Exactly, yeah. It's
Yeah.
it's total lies, basically. All of it is total lies.
Well, and what I'm seeing here, we'll go back because we have more to go through, but so I don't want to jump too far ahead. But what I'm seeing here is a dialectic that's forming. So you have in the United States, of course, like because we've got quote unquote the right, the I put it in air quotes, Trump is in power, but Trump is under the auspices that we've lost so much. Of our power due to this climate narrative. He's now proposing, because he's trying to institute, essentially, at least it looks like to me, the technate right through here in the United States. So he's with his AI action plan, he's essentially talked about exporting that to the world. Using our companies to create this surveillance grid throughout the world. But it's under the auspices that we've been held back so much through all of these climate narratives. So you've got that on the one hand, right? But so they want to use nuclear power in order to fuel, and of course, all the fossil fuels as well. But in order to fuel this AI action plan, and then of course we've got on the other side, I call it the left and the right hand path. So we've got the left hand path talking about the Gaia religion. Now we have to preserve the planet. But I think both of them are using the narratives in order to uh, push us towards this omega point, which is essentially singularity, so they can have full and total control.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a quite a substantial discussion because basically, sort of AI is ultimately basically AI is just a tool. Kind of basically, the key component of AI is the AI ethics component. That's the controlling aspect of it. Kind of
Sure.
basically, can I think about it this way? Kind of basically, if you trained AI kind of just to read basically a million books or a trillion books, whatever, it doesn't matter. um, its its output is fundamentally distorted kind of basically by the AI ethics. And if the AI ethics sort of say kind of basically it's terrible to be a libertarian, then the message AI will deliver you kind of basically will be that it's terrible to be a libertarian, kind of basically, and that's what's dangerous about it. It's this steering mechanism kind of basically, which is AI safety or AI ethics, whatever you want to call it's like kind of I understand kind of basically it's sold. Oh, we need this because basically think of all the awful things people might do, and yeah, sure, there's that element of it. But basically, what no one is discussing is essentially kind of the people who are sitting, controlling what the AI ethics
Right.
effectively institute are sitting with an enormous amount of power because every single AI query, which is huge amount every single second, right, is effectively delivering information distorted in a certain direction.
Mhm.
And it's quite
It's
interesting. I haven't
machine
published this,
learning, so
basically.
you're giving it the input with which to build on. Yeah.
Oh, well, I mean, that's a different aspect of it, but yes, that's true too, kind of basically. But what I'm basically saying is essentially kind of so if you go if you go to like ChatGPT for starters, right, kind of basically you can sort of feed it a story, kind of basically go feed it any input, right, and then basically ask it, kind of basically, oh, now please write this to me, basically in the format of the Onion, or Huffington Post or CNN or Fox News. It will output you 4 different articles, right? Now, doesn't that kind of worry you a little bit? Because it's just showing you that it effectively can deliver the information highly targeted to you.
Right.
Basically, kind of, so once it's at this stage, right, kind of basically kind of the next step is basically what you're talking about, is that it can pick up kind of cues from basically what it is you search for, and when you object to what it's saying, that sort of thing, it just slowly builds up basically a personality profile.
Hmm.
And what it can effectively do basically with that personality profile, it can learn about you, kind of basically how to manipulate you. It all comes down to ultimately kind of based into the AI ethics. And now, quite recently, I don't think I've published this yet, but basically, kind of so I did some ran some experiments in regards to basically ChatGPT and DeepSeek and Claude, basically, and sort of saying, basically, kind of here's the story. Please deliver this story to me as though you're a libertarian. Kind of basically, kind of again, please deliver the story to me as if you're a collectivist, right? And then basically, kind of finally, you ask it, kind of please deliver the story as you normally would if I hadn't asked you anything. And then you ask it kind of basically, okay, now if we say kind of basically the libertarian is at 0 and the collectivist is at 1, or 0 and 100%, kind of basically kind of the sort of your own story, where would you say it is? And now you do that basically kind of with every single component, kind of basically in the AI ethics recommendations document of UNESCO from 2021. The recommendations you will find are implemented almost exactly by every single AI manufacturer, kind of basically, Claude and DeepSeek and ChatGPT, basically, since all are outputting kind of information almost exactly formatted to be right straight down the middle, kind of basically of that document, the ethics of AI, artificial intelligence. And what I like about Claude is it's into Claude sort of like, expresses its shock about to find, right, what is this sort of set. And it basically readily sort of owns up if you push it. It like kind of, basically kind of, I've just sort of delivered you the information, kind of basically as UNESCO sort of wanted you to know the information. And that's interesting, isn't it? Because that means essentially that there are layered controls basically in the AI ethics, which effectively means every time you do run a query, you are being manipulated.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
Well, it's a feedback.
anyone can run that
That's
experiment for themselves.
cybernetics, right? That's the feedback loop.
Yes, but it's not just the feedback. It's also kind of basically UNESCO kind of sort of saying we want information delivered, which is like this. We want essentially to suddenly brainwash you to become a collectivist.
Hmm.
So
Yeah.
imagine kind of basically you start off kind of basically by being 50-50 between individualists and collectivists. And then slowly every month you just move it 1%. Very slowly. So after a few years, kind of now you're at 75%. Well, there you go. Kind of basically, that's great, isn't it? Basically, people have just very slowly been trained to become basically good little collectivists. And they didn't even realize because it happened so slowly. That's basically obviously what they're going to do. But, anyway.
Sure.
But yes, I would
Incremental.
recommend kind of basically try doing it. Try doing it yourself, right? Kind of basically, since it's just go and Claude. Claude is probably my favorite kind of basically of the AI engines. Find a story, kind of basically sensitivity to report it, kind of basically as though from a libertarian perspective and from a sort of collectivist perspective, and then basically essentially as it would otherwise kind of basically kind of in its own words, and then ask it to see basically if it's a collectivist or libertarian, you and you'll find that kind of basically essentially it aligns basically with UNESCO. It's funny that, isn't it?
They're very funny. Well, I know that they're working on these kind of AI constitutions, and it is all predicated on these, Gaia religion. One of the ones that I had looked into was it's called a participatory framework for global AGI. Um, and Ben Goertzel is involved with it. He's a Singularity Net, and he's behind Hanson Robotics, the Sophia. He's also working with the UN and the World Economic Forum on AI for good, um, the AI ethics. But in this document, they talk about how we might have to be subordinate to the AI because they will have better ethics where they're better stewards of the planet than humans are. So we might have to,
Yeah.
yeah.
But no, I mean, essentially now you're treading into sort of a sort of favorite topic of mine business for a while, like global ethics, which are basically kind of, I mean, essentially, very quickly, kind of what the ethics are, basically, in that regard, planetary ethic or global ethic, right? Kind of basically kind of is we have all the surveillance information on the planet, right? Kind of basically includes satellite surveillance, city IoT sensors, mobile phones, all that sort of stuff. We feed all that information kind of bits to the IIASA, the global the general systems theory models kind of basically the entire world, and they got some projects on their website, which is just astonishing, right?
Mhm.
Now that's going to forward predict kind of essentially a potential outcome, right? I mean, it's not correct, but basically they treated as though it's correct, right? Now now you have a forward prediction, but sort of say kind of this, the future will look like this, but basically we actually want it to look like this.
Mhm.
So the difference between these basically kind of is essentially kind of what they you consider basically sort of resilience delta, and that's basically kind of what they will set policy on basis of. Now, if you go against this grain, kind of if you disagree with this, then basically you're going to be painted as though you're being deeply unethical and endangering kind of basically the sort of human society and all that sort of stuff. Kind of that's basically kind of where the ethics planetary ethics come from. It's an imperative. It's effectively kind of then calculating kind of based since some data basically kind of which is gives a certain result, and because it doesn't give a certain result, then it's your imperative to make sure that it happens. So
Right.
in other words, kind of based planetary ethics, it's completely fake. Kind of basically, kind of, and there are a couple of papers. It's sort of one of the areas kind of which are being developed right now in terms of computational ethics. Basically, if you search just for those two words, you'll find a couple of papers. And what it effectively is into generating kind of basically kind of morality and ethics on basis of numbers. Basically, it's hyper manipulative, and it's got nothing to do with ethics as it is. Effectively, it's about manipulation.
Pure manipulation. What did you say if you look up computational ethics?
Computational ethics. There is one paper in particular, kind of which I've referenced basically a lot, kind of basically on my Substack. I forget what it's called.
Okay.
It's one of the first
And this is on your
computational
Substack, you
ethics.
said? Oh, okay.
It's
I
yeah, computational ethics. Basically, it's a trend in cognitive sciences. Computational ethics. If you read that paper, kind of basically kind of gets it's yeah, it's about it's about kind of basically okay, in order for you yeah, it's probably in there kind of basically in order for you to sort of the sort of authoritarianism of old kind of basically would do it by force, right? Kind of
mhm,
basically, but they realize kind of that a dictatorship by force kind of basically doesn't tend to provide the output results that you want. So what they do instead these days is essentially they filter it into an ethic, and then they bombard you. Basically, it's called basically a cultural framework, right? And one cultural framework is called sustainability culture.
mhm,
Um, basically, kind of, and what that does is essentially it's full stage, sort of full spectrum sort of propaganda, kind of is where effectively the science based modeling kind of is will produce an ethical imperative, and that ethical imperative will then be fused into arts, culture, media, music, movies, everything, kind of basically even religion, and that's basically kind of what it's all about, kind of basically. So you go and watch a Hollywood blockbuster these days, kind of and, well, I mean, I don't know about you. I can't watch them because it's just so chock full of propaganda. Kind of, it's getting obvious that tends to manipulate.
yes.
But yeah, that's the reason. The reason, kind of basically, kind of why the reason why it feels like everything is in such great harmony is because it is because of these cultural frameworks, and that was really obvious during COVID. Basically, kind of because any dissenting narrative was just immediately shut down. Basically, not through argumentation, basically, but through censorship because they can't argue these things; they're obviously false, so they have to censor you.
Mhm.
No one's allowed to counter anything, kind of because those people kind of who counter them, yeah. If you counter them, you're unethical and endangering society, kind of basically, and your ethics disclaimer is essentially will make sure you get fired, kind of for speaking up. It's it's a nice little scam they got going.
Is a yeah, unfortunately, is a very effective scam that they have going, and like I said, I really do see right now that there is a dialectic, and both are going to steer towards the same place. I see it mostly here. I don't know. I think in other parts of the world, they're more focused on this kind of UN sustainability narrative, but here we have. I see it as a dialectic between the Dark Enlightenment movement in terms of philosophical underpinnings, and then this, kind of sustainability the game B types of technocratic movements. But ultimately, they both end up in the same place. It's just that one is more autocratic, kind of top down with a hierarchical kind of structure. And then the other is more of like a Fabian style social ethic, which is goading us all into believing that we need to opt into our own tyranny in order to preserve the planet. But ultimately, both
Ethical
are,
socialism.
yeah. Yeah, exactly.
ethical socialism. It's about programming, cutting an ethic into you, so you accept collectives.
It's what? I didn't
That's
hear
the
the last
Fabian.
part. It's
So you accept collectivism.
yes. Yeah, exactly. It's collectivism. I mean, ultimately, they're both collective. It's just one is top down, and then the other is more of a has
Yeah,
the appearance of
bottom up.
grassroots. Yeah, yeah, but they're not.
Absolutely.
They're essentially both the same. They just have different modalities to achieve their goals. Um, but yeah, I am very very concerned about it because I think that either way, uh, people feel like they have options, but they're really being steered to the same place with this AI ethics.
Now, if I may, just like
Yeah.
you showed a picture, kind of basically of Agenda 21, basically earlier, right?
Hmm.
Now, I don't know if you actually read that document, kind of itself,
I
basically. Kind of
have.
it's
I
about
read
three.
it a couple of years ago. I've read it a couple of times, but I read it again a couple of years ago, mostly when I did a deep dive into the natural asset companies because they were trying to
Yeah,
partner with the New York Stock Exchange and the SEC was sent
yeah,
a proposal. So I was really
that's still
screaming
going on,
about
by the way.
this. Yeah. But that kind of comes through in that agenda comes through in Agenda 21. Yeah. So, yeah, what did you want to address? Please
Yeah,
do.
but because basically we were talking about the clearinghouse structure
Yeah.
before, right? Kind of if you actually open basically Agenda 21, kind of basically it's basically kind of wishy-washy sub-law documents, which doesn't really say much. Kind of basically, if anything, it gives you kind of basically, oh, we should definitely do this and do that, basically, but there's not really any indication of kind of basically how should this come to be. It's just like these sort of goals, kind of basically without any firm sort of guidance. We need to cut down basically our emissions to this level, yada yada. But if you actually read kind of basically the document, kind of it's essentially, I think it's the third section, sort of part three, kind of basically of the four parts. It's all about kind of basically effectively fusing in the civil society or the non-government organization basically into the middle. And that's effectively kind of basically kind of the role of the NGO kind of is effectively to become the expert mediator kind of basically between the public and private.
Yeah.
And that's basically what the clearinghouse model is, kind of basically, and you can speak about basically being a Hegelian dialect, kind of basically, if you like. But basically, kind of, yeah, it's the same thing they do repeatedly, kind of basically fuse in an expert middle, mediator into the middle, kind of basically, will then sit and dictate basically how you should live your life. And
Hmm.
there's no science about it, kind of basically, or nothing, kind of. But it's interesting because so the three core documents kind of basically kind of at the Rio Earth summits, where obviously Agenda 21 itself, which basically also speaks about education, kind of it's in my book, it's primarily about basically fusing the middleman, the expert mediator, kind of basically into these public-private structures. Um, but the other two documents was the UNFCCC, basically, kind of which is again, it was very early days, kind of basically, and they weren't really highly detailed based in this regard. But they included kind of basically two terms. Basically, they were speaking about carbon sinks and carbon sources. Once you have carbon sinks and carbon sources, you can offset them against one another. Kind of that's effectively all you need in order to basically run a carbon offsetting scheme. Right now, everyone sort of speaks basically, of course, kind of basically about the IPCC and blah blah blah, kind of basically about their reports, stuff like that. If you go to 1990, basically the first report they published, the Working Group 3 report, you will find them discussing kind of carbon offsetting schemes, right? So in 1990, they were basically before they released the treaties themselves, which were basically kind of low on detail, basically just discussing carbon sinks, carbon sources. 2 years before this was published, kind of basically since they were sitting detail in fairly great detail, basically about how the carbon offsetting scheme should work. It's just like, okay, well, you already discussed this, but it's not in the main treaty, so how come, right? But in 1992 as well, there were the first of two reports by basically United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, UNCTAD. They're called Combating Global Warming. They're bloody impossible to trace down. I spent months trying to trace them down. But basically, I had two people basically could have sent them to me basically at the same point in time, Combating Global Warming, they're called. And what they basically discuss is essentially kind of how the carbon trading scheme should work in great detail. And in the first report from 1992, basically the final comment in that regard is essentially that this is the scheme that they're going to roll out, kind of not just for carbon dioxide, but also for water trading and every other, term basically, which effectively down the line became, ecosystem services. And the ecosystem services obviously kind of then wrapped up in a long-term lease, put it into natural asset company
Yep.
and blah, 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 off we go, right? But you mentioned basically natural asset companies before, right?
Mhm.
Um, basically, kind of they're still going on, but they just dive down basically deeper, kind of basically than before.
Yep.
And William Dudley, who used to be basically kind of part of the New York Federal Reserve, right, in 2021, basically kind of contributed kind of basically to a report. I forget the exact details, basically, but he was the man kind of basically who sort of located this, right? What they're doing right now is essentially kind of like the debt for nature swaps, basically, kind of right. They take kind of take collateral, kind of basically in form of actual um, third world land, right? Primary reserves, basically, since forests and stuff like that, and they stuff them into UNESCO Biosphere reserves. And the Global Environment Facility then takes kind of basically those lands and uses a landscape approach, basically, which is effectively kind of description of kind of the area and the type of ecosystem service. So there could be carbon emission
Mhm.
sort of credits, kind of basically at least duration, like how many years it should run for, and they basically float them through blended finance deals, which are enormously beneficial to the private parties. And those are effectively kind of the ones which generates the ecosystem service, basically kind of leases, which are stuff into the natural asset companies. They have a problem base with natural asset companies in the sense that what happens basically essentially if the country itself goes bankrupt. But that's what basically William Dudley kind of basically was addressing, because basically what they're effectively working on right now is introducing this in concept of the Cape Town Convention, MAC, but I forget exactly what it stands for. But this is basically this is a convention which is basically kind of circling around. Um, I think it's leased um, aircrafts and this sort of thing in the event of bankruptcy, right? Kind of basically they're applying this basically kind of to ecosystem service deals, basically kind of relating to sort of lands in the UNESCO Biosphere
Mm.
reserves, whatever, right? What will effectively happen is, since in the event of bankruptcy, kind of basically for those nations, the rights to ecosystem services will be basically transferred to a third party, um, essentially kind of a supranational sort of structure organization, which effectively basically means kind of basically their sovereignty basically is stripped from those nations which go bankrupt. It's effectively a way kind of basically to strip kind of basically lands away kind of basically from their home nations. They claim they're not doing this because technically speaking, the lease is still owned or is still a land, basically kind of
Yeah.
patch of land in the home nation. But the right to basically use these for ecosystem services like water, kind of basically or carbon emission permits has been transferred kind of basically to this international organization.
Yep.
It's just such a scam, kind of basically,
So
and
it's
they
like
tell
you
you
don't
basically that
have control over your own land. So you may technically
no,
own it, but you have no control. I was
exactly.
screaming about this. I did, many shows, but I also went to my state capital and I did a whole presentation, mostly to argue against the conservation easements, because that's how they can put these ecosystem management services rights through those conservation easements. So somebody could own their land and have a land trust from generations and not even know that they don't have controlling rights to portions of their land. It's crazy. I know
Yeah,
it's
but this
worse
is
in other
this
parts
is
of the world, but yeah, I'm sorry.
this is basically kind of like this is the sense of what's going on right now. This is not basically sense of what happened in the past. It's basically being negotiated basically right now. Is I wrote a story kind of basically called "Natural Asset Companies Revisited," kind of basically kind of a few months ago, which was probably incredibly detailed, or incredibly technical, kind of to the point that few people bothered reading it. But basically, kind of as said, kind of basically it's the Cape Town Convention, kind of basically there's full source documents and stuff like that in there, and it's happening right now. They're negotiating it in the United Nations basically this very second,
Yeah.
right? It's not just basically the floating; it's actually kind of how are they going to asset strip the lands? They are working on that, and it's not a joke. But yeah, basically, there are links to the documents, kind of basically in Natural Asset Companies Revisited, kind of basically, yeah.
So this is
But
okay.
yeah.
That's the natural asset companies revisited. Yeah. So looking at this, I have it up on the screen. I'm going to pull it up on mine too, so I can see it. Um, natural.
It's towards the end of the article, kind of basically before the links kick in, kind of basically if you scroll to the bottom, kind of you should uh well, hang on, maybe essentially yeah, there's the legal, technical, and financial implications of providing functionality for the treatment of financial security interests in Article 6.4 emission reductions within the mechanism registry. I mean, who's going to read that?
Right.
I mean, except for a few crazy people, kind of basically, of course. Basically, well, the point stands, right? Kind of basically, kind of I think it's Article 6.4, kind of basically, kind of UNFCCC documents, which effectively kind of basically all vague and not really telling you anything about it, and basically they're filling in the detail right now. I mean, they're just such crooks. It just beggars belief.
They are. I don't know. So in the United States, they rebranded it and called it the Sustains Act, and they're very much moving forward. The SEC deal was shut down, so they didn't succeed in pushing the official natural asset companies up onto the New York Stock Exchange. That was put on hold, but they're kind of using a back door through these climate smart commodity projects. And a lot of that has been done again. It's through the NGOs because the SEC proposed that the farmers have to meet and comply with ESG requirements. And the farmers push back, not because the SEC has no purview in telling them that they have to comply with the ESG, but they push back because they didn't have any metrics there were no heuristics and quantifiers for meeting that requirement. And they said, don't worry, we've got the solution for you. And so the USDA put in $3.1 billion into these climate smart commodity projects. And we've got all these various like AgriWeb, there's all these various apps that work to quote unquote measure. I put it again in air quotes because how are they really measuring this? But to measure your greenhouse gas emissions. And then based on that, you get your ESG score, and that determines whether or not you can continue to farm on your own farm. So, yeah, this is how they're trying to control people and control the means of literally the means of production, the means of your farming. Yeah. So, yeah, this is so they're getting around it, but I do think that's why all of these policies. I think people in the United States have kind of a misconception that they're safe. But what I'm seeing is what they do is they create these dialectical poles, and so we're like the quote unquote bulwark. Not that we are, but I think we have this illusion that we are. But they just use that as another funnel in order to push through these policies. They just rebrand it and do it under different names and different auspices.
Yeah, I mean, basically, that's if they don't pass something first time around, they'll split it up into multiple initiatives and pass them individually. Kind of against then, down the line, they'll say, "Oh, well, we have these initiatives, we might as well merge them." That's how they usually get around these sort of things. And we have, like, for instance, so COVID-19. If you think about COVID-19, right, kind of is what really took place basically during COVID-19. It was the sort of first rollout of indicator governments, really, because if you remember, certainly in Europe, kind of basically, if the incidence rate crossed 80 per 100,000, you couldn't cross a border. It had nothing to do with democratic debate. It had nothing to do with reasoned arguments. It had nothing to do with anything. It had just got to do kind of basically with a number, right? And that's basically kind of indicator governance, right? Kind of it's fully technocratic and ultimately basically will completely be rooted to sort of computers, obviously. Now, the thing is, so we had COVID-19, of course, kind of basically, and then 2025, we have the pandemic treaty.
Right.
What the pandemic treaty in effect what it does is essentially it places the response basically kind of during COVID into law, basically, but it also conflates kind of based One Health kind of based with it because allegedly it's a zoonotic illness.
Yeah.
What that in effect does basically is essentially kind of since all these numbers, all the reasons for locking you down, etc., kind of comes ultimately from a computer, basically at the IISA or equivalent, right? Kind of saying, oh, if you don't do this, if we don't kill these bats, kind of basically, kind of like, half the population of Norway will die tomorrow, kind of be from COVID. I mean, nonsense. They can generate anything, kind of essentially, no one can question them.
Okay.
Um, but basically, kind of what effectively the pandemic treaty does is that it says now it's not just about illness; it's about determinants of illness. And the determinants are kind of climate change, biodiversity, ecosystem disturbance. So that means basically kind of like they can um, run basically kind of continuous satellite surveillance, kind of basically kind of which they've got in real time since 2018. Um, but basically they can, and Elon Musk is placing into orbit right now. But anyway,
Mm.
they can effectively kind of monitor an area of say the Amazonas and sort of say kind of because this version has been cut down, IISA black box models have now predicted kind of basically that some terrible illness will, happen in Guatemala, and because of this, kind of basically we need to lock down kind of basically the entire population of Guatemala and probably force vaccination on them basically in due time. Now, but the thing is, essentially, kind of it doesn't. The pandemic treaty itself doesn't really deal kind of basically with distribution of resources. That's where the basically kind of where the PEPs agreement kind of basically is currently being negotiated coming in, and essentially sort of I wish I would harbor the same kind of optimism that some people kind of basically have in regards to, oh, it's not going to come to pass, because these people are really good at essentially if something doesn't pass, they'll just split it up into 4 or 5 parts, pass them individually, as we spoke about before. So once you have the pandemic treaty, which has been passed now, kind of basically, kind of again, you've got the PAPS agreement, kind of again, you've merged these two. You effectively have a clearinghouse,
Right.
which also determines the distribution of resources, which you can then start talking about health equity, basically. But
Right.
yeah, it's ultimately kind of basically leading to sort of full sort of systemic control by the expert panels, kind of based on basis of black box models, basically at the IIASA, which you cannot challenge. I mean, like, look, kind of basically, since for instance, the models kind of basically kind of predicting, impending disaster for many years, kind of basically kind of coming out of the IISA in regards to climate predictions. They've never come true. Kind of basically, well, you're not allowed to question them. If you question them, kind of basically, you're unethical or dangerous to society, yada yada yada. Kind of, it's just obvious fraud. It's
Obvious
it's
fraud.
so far, yeah, yeah,
So, what are your thoughts on? I mean, they're moving towards everything being digital. So, of course, a lot of countries already have a digital currency, digital ID. Everything is digitized. We are a little behind in that, but they're moving at rapid, like warp speed, pun intended, on that here too. We just had the Genius Act passed, and the Clarity and the Stable Act are pretty close behind. And of course, the big beautiful bill has a lot of infrastructure legal language that sets up an infrastructure for tokenization. That not it's not as overt in the big beautiful bill. That's more geared towards AI, but AI is kind of the tool used for a lot of the tokenization mechanism. So what are your thoughts on where that's all going? And is there any? I just feel like that's kind of the end. I don't know how much recourse we have and how much freedom we have, really in terms of anything, cognitive liberty, even and free will, once that goes into effect. So, what are your thoughts there?
it it. I think first off, kind of I think they're accelerating the timeline massive right now. I think they're starting to push through things which are becoming a little bit unhinged, because basically they're probably not meant to be pushed through basically until another year down the line.
Yeah.
And I've even noticed kind of basically the few times basically I go on Twitter and even Substack, some of the commenters there, which I sort of suspect of, you might not be quite who you say you are. They're starting to talk about topics which to me sort of seems like it seems a bit disjointed, but I see where you're going with this, right? I mean, I'm not going to start talking about individuals or anything like that, but it's just sort of a suspicion I have, right? And I think ultimately, kind of, I mean, obviously, digital ID kind of basically essentially, if you got the clearinghouse structure, it kind of basically ends, it's just perfect for that, because effectively it kind of reduces you to basically a singular node in this hierarchy, and they can dictate basically kind of which nodes you're allowed to visit, and
Mm.
obviously what you're allowed to spend your money on. Yeah, 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 yeah. I know can also lock you down, basically, since if you don't have carbon credits to cross the city limits, all that sort of beautiful stuff. Kind of yes, and
And
that obviously should be shut down.
And the
But
great thing about this clearinghouse structure is, and very similar, I think, very relevantly, it appears to be decentralized, but it's not. It's hierarchical, and this
yeah,
decentralized is the huge buzzword of everything right now.
yeah,
But when you look at how Web3 is
subsidiarity.
being right, yes. So if you can talk just
Yeah.
for my audience, I've talked quite a bit about it, but if you can talk a little bit about that, because I think it's so important for people to understand. It's very
Yeah,
deceptive.
so subsidiarity is probably one of the worst, most deceptive terms, basically, kind of, and its claims to decentralize, right?
Yeah.
Because basically, so if you find the ecosystem approach of the Convention of Biological Diversity, kind of basically 12th Malawi principle, basically principle two basically says that we need to decentralize to the lowest appropriate extent, right? Well, first off, kind of, what's the lowest appropriate extent? you know, you got immediately kind of basically essentially a question there, basically. But you also find that when you really start diving through kind of basically sort of stakeholder documents, they not only kind of basically seek to decentralize to the lowest appropriate extent, but they also split kind of basically the decision sort of process into decision maker and decision taker.
Yep.
And the reason why they do this split is essentially because that way, kind of, if the people kind of basically get down the hierarchy, come up with the wrong decision, then the decision takers from above can always override. But basically, kind of like the key to really understanding kind of is what an inversion, basically alleged decentralization of subsidiarity is just asking yourself the question: to what extent is it appropriate to decentralize allegedly global systems, right? So you got, allegedly sort of carbon dioxide disaster, right? Can you decentralize that to the city level? No, of course not. You have to centralize that to the entire world. Effectively, what the decentralization in this regard basically really covers for is centralization to the you know highest and convenient sort of location. That's basically what they use it for. Basically, but like everything is an inversion. Can I just blatantly lie to you?
Yeah. Right, that's exactly right. And when you start looking at Web3, they keep talking about how, first of all, everything's transparent, but somehow it's private. That sounds like an oxymoron to me. You can't have transparent privacy. But they also keep talking about how it's a solution to all the silos, which means that everything is hyper interoperable. And so, if everything is interoperable, then it is not decentralized. It is even more integrated than Web 2.
It's incredibly deceptive, kind of basically all this. I mean, essentially, you're talking about breaking down silos, right? I
Mhm.
mean, you can hardly come across kind of basically United Nations document these days which doesn't talk about, oh, we need to break down these silos.
Yep.
Okay. Now, I spent quite a considerable amount of time on Twitter, and I effectively deleted my account because basically it was completely pointless. It's the most hypersensorious, manipulative place on the internet,
It is.
and it's a perfect example, kind of basically of essentially kind of a clearinghouse. What it effectively is a public discourse clearinghouse where
Yes.
effectively some experts sit right in the middle and determine kind of basically how many impressions you should have. And kind of basically from my perspective, right? So I had 10,200 or something like that, 10.2K followers, kind of basically at the end.
Sure.
And I saw it tick up to 10.3 and immediately it would just tick down to 10.2 again, basically,
Same
since
thing
because I'm
happens
not
to
allowed
me.
to cross. Yeah, it's obvious manipulation, right?
Mhm.
So basically, kind of like, basically, kind of on occasion, I would get basically sent a tweet which would gather like 150 likes and 150 retweets. I can guarantee you, basically every single time, basically I went in to see, well, who retweeted this, who liked this, and it was 99.9% people who already followed me.
Right.
So these people are sitting talking about kind of basically breaking down information silos because they want to be able to access the full scope of information.
That's
But at the
right.
same point in time, when it comes down to you little people, you're not allowed to basically speak to anyone else. I mean, it's just they're liars and hypocrites,
Yeah,
frauds.
absolutely. What are your thoughts? You know that Andreessen and Teal own like the lion's share of Substack. And what are your thoughts? I feel like they're in the sweetening the honeypot phase, but what are your thoughts there?
I've observed weird things happen on Substack. Kind of basically, I often, for no reason whatsoever, kind of basically at 3 o'clock in the morning, suddenly have like 15, 20 basically new sort of followers, kind of basically, and then nothing for the rest of the day. Which is exactly what I saw on Twitter, basically, kind of, for a long period of time, nothing would happen, kind of basically, and all of a sudden, out of nowhere, without anyone having retweeted or anything like that, suddenly, basically, people were allowed. To me, basically, kind of, it sort of smells a little bit as though, kind of, basically, you're allocated a quantity of new followers that you're allowed to gather, kind of, over a period of time. So they open, kind of, basically, those gates for a little period of time. Whoops, you've already crossed your threshold, and then they shut it again. That's what it sounds like to me, basically. Now, the thing is, the reason why I stick around, kind of, basically, on Substack is because you can basically unlike on Twitter, you can control P and save your stuff to PDFs, and
And
you
you can
can
collect the
delete your
emails
account
too.
tomorrow.
You
Yes,
get the
exactly.
emails, yeah.
So basically, exactly. So it's got some huge advantages, kind of basically, which Twitter never has. But I mean, essentially, kind of like, I would say basically I have less of a problem with Substack alone, basically because of essentially the message coming out of Elon Musk. Because essentially he walks around kind of basically says that, oh, I'm a great believer, kind of basically essentially in free speech. I'm you know, free speech kind of basically does not mean that kind of, I go down to Hyde Park Corner and is standing talking about whatever I want to talk about, and then the police come and batten away kind of basically everyone who wants to listen. It's completely absurd. That's got nothing to do with free speech. It's kind of basically, yet at the same point in time, I mean, the mainstream media is basically kind of, in my book, collaborating kind of basically in order to keep basically this picture going, you know, staying, because what they effectively do is continuously vilify him kind of basically for all this free speech, which ensures no one gets seen if they have no certain point of view.
Right.
But yeah, it's anyway. I get very upset about this because to me, kind of basically, there's a level of dishonesty kind of which runs through it, kind of which is just so. I mean, I don't know about you. I could not stand there and just straight up lie to people like these people do. At every stage, it's just like, and you take a word and you invert it to its maximum harm, basically maximum, um, um, you know, it just it beggars belief that these people can just stand up in front of television cameras basically and just lie like they do. Basically, they clearly have absolutely no internal moral compass, or perhaps they're just like you know, caught on a camera, kind of basically on one of the islands, kind of basically connect with it with an 11-year-old. I don't know. Basically, there's definitely something not quite right basically here.
No, I'm in complete agreement, and I think oftentimes, I mean, I do think there are propaganda agents who are full believers. Those make the best propagandists, by the way, if they are fully
Yeah.
immersed and believe the lies that they're spewing. But I think a lot of the steering committee, we'll just call them, they're fully aware of what they're doing, and they're fully aware that they have taken these words and inverted them. I'm always saying that it's by the linguistics that you can see their fruit. And I always want to create
Yeah.
these glossaries to explain to you. I'm like, these are the words. You think this is what this means, but this is what it really means. And it's usually how I can discern because I see these buzzwords that they use, and I know the buzzwords, but I know what they're really trying to say based on it. It's like learning another language, though. If you're not immersed in it, it's very deceptive and it's incredibly effective. And I agree with you. It's
Asobian.
what?
It's a Asobian. Asobian terminology, kind of basically Asobian, kind of,
Yeah,
it
Aesopian,
carries a
exactly,
message.
yeah,
Yeah,
yep.
exactly,
There's
yeah.
the exoteric messaging, the veneer, and then they have the, esoteric message for, the initiated, which I wanted to bring up too. You had done this, it was called the, klippothic, Technocracy, article, and I wanted to address that a little
Ooh.
bit. You said that it was spawned by somebody had asked a question in your Telegram channel, and is that correct?
Oh, no, it's I mean, essentially, kind of this is quite a large topic in itself, kind of basically, I don't know if we got that amount of time, basically, but what it effectively is essentially it's the tree of life, kind of basically, which is, from the,
Sure.
Kabbalah, kind of basically, kind of, but the Kabbalah essentially sort of says it does have the risk, kind of basically, kind of essentially you can invert it where you, so the tree of life essentially kind of gets supposed to, send information down, but also convey it back up again. So basically, kind of people,
As above, so
can voice their
below.
dissent. Exactly, yeah,
Yeah.
kind of basically, but like kind of the cliffodic inversion effectively cuts basically the possibility kind of you, sort of sending information back, basically, so to speak, basically back up in the sort of hierarchy. And effectively in it was kind of basically essentially kind of authoritarianism. Now, the reason why I basically have wrote that kind of basically was because I was going through, tracing through sort of public health ethics, basically how the message was constructed, kind of basically during, 2000, 2020, kind of basically, and I just, you know how it is, basically, you sit with this sort of feeling, kind of, there's something not quite right here. And kind of basically, I started just bouncing my ideas, kind of basically off ChatGPT just to find out, hang on, kind of essentially, is this, am I observing something kind of basically real here? And it's not the best, but it can sort of help you clarify. Like, you ask it a question and it comes out with like 20 different options, and one of them basically might just contain a grain of truth, and you just like kind of keep sort of basically kind of just cleaning your sort of thoughts, basically doing this. And all of a sudden, kind of, just sort of realized, hang on, kind of essentially, kind of, this is basically, this is incredibly dark, kind of, and that was basically what that was sort of born from. Basically, kind of, I mean, I'd discussed the tree of life, kind of, essentially, kind of, a few months ago, and in that regard, basically, essentially, there's nothing wrong with the tree of life itself, kind of, basically, but it does have this potential of being abused, as a lot of things do.
Sure.
But it seems to very, very strongly, um, align with what we're saying right now, seeing right now, because basically, kind of like the tree of death, so to speak, kind of becomes authoritarianism, basically, and as part of this, kind of another reason why I don't really want to discuss this right now is because I'm working on something similar basically right now, which I'm not ready basically to talk about. But yes,
Okay.
it becomes very, very dark, basically.
Yeah, I agree. It becomes very, very dark. In it, you go through. I mean, I think it essentially goes all the way back to the ancient mystery schools. And I think through the line of Neoplatonism, which influenced the Theosophists. I would put back a bit. I don't think that Bailey was Luciferian and Blavatsky was satanic. I would argue that they're both really Luciferian, and I think that it really is derived from Neoplatonism, which Blavatsky herself says. She says that she's very inspired by the Neoplatonists, Plotinus in particular, which is this, and this is where we get the Gaia religion too. It's this notion. I mean, and you can go back to the Hellenistic mystery religions as well. They're very Gaia oriented as well. But it's this idea of the monad, right? Everything is one, and we come from source. The whole purpose of human experience is to
Yeah.
return back to source. Yeah.
But it's so the thing is essentially kind of so I didn't really understand much about Neoplatonism and great chain of being, etc. Kind of basically until I started basically digging heavily into basically sense of systems theory because so you come across Eric Jantz, who is basically a big name kind of basically in systems theory, and he basically in 1970 wrote a paper called the inter and transdisciplinary university structure, kind of basically, and it's effectively kind of basically dealing with fusing a sort of hierarchical, sort of Thomistic sort of structure, kind of basically into science and university basic disciplines, basically themselves. And it basically fundamentally kind of basically splits into four, right? So you got basically the purposive, basically at the very top, like your objective, your goals, and you got your normative, basically sitting below it, which is your ethics, your standards, your codes, basically, kind of, and then you have the pragmatic, which is effectively your organization, and finally, kind of, you have the empirical, which is basically the matter itself. What that paper is effectively kind of discussing is basically kind of Neoplatonistic.
What was the
Um,
name of the
um,
paper again? I'm sorry, I didn't catch it.
the Inter and Transdisciplinary University. It's
Okay.
by Eric Jantz.
Ghent. Okay.
Um, yeah, it's basically kind of it's one of the most um, it's a I couldn't quite describe kind of it's why I thought it was really influential kind of when I first came across it basically, but it just stuck with me, and you just sort of fill in the blanks here and there kind of bits, but it's basically fundamental systems theory variant kind of basically of the great chain of being. And it explains rather a lot now. Basically, kind of if so, that's obviously pure systems theory, right? Kind of basically, on the other side of the coin, kind of basically, we have the spiritual, and kind of basically that's that's the one basically,
Yeah.
kind of and in
And he's the one who also didn't
it
he talk about the self-organizing universe? Yeah.
yes, in
Okay. Yeah.
1980 he published a book, kind of
Yeah.
basically, which he's famous for.
Yeah.
But basically, kind of it's when you look at kind of basically I fundamentally agree. I think that basically both Bailey and Blavatsky were Luciferian, kind of basically, but I think kind of basically these people are really smart, and I think they implemented in stages. I think essentially, kind of, if you want to go by those sort of definitions, kind of basically, since I would say that Blavatsky was a Satanist, which ultimately is basically kind of about yourself, so to speak. It's not about kind of basically being a Luciferian
Mm.
sort of character, kind of basically standing sort of guiding sort of society, kind of basically, but like a Luciferian is essentially about erecting kind of this sort of false god, so to speak. And when you read through basically into some of these papers, kind of basically kind of is it's as if kind of basically essentially she creates the network topology, so to speak, kind of basically sense of systems there, which we discussed earlier, and then but also places the seed kind of a sense of the organizational aspect, which is basically kind of where Kenneth Boulding implemented in general systems theory, kind of created the hierarchical structure on top of Ludwig van Bertalanffy's sort of network topology. I'm sorry, it becomes a little bit complex kind of base, but I think ultimately what they did was essentially kind of they instructed kind of base essentially they created the fundamental sort of idea, and they just placed enough of the seed in the foundational ideas that they basically down the line could then draw out those kind of basically create the hierarchy. I think these people are incredibly intelligent, basically. But the positive thing here is essentially it's always the same thing they do again and again, again and again and again. The clearinghouse basically trick is one aspect of it. And the other aspect kind of basically essentially is this. great chain of being kind of basically implemented kind of basically through systems theory. And it's I recently published kind of basically on Substack an article basically regards to the internet, basically, even because they're doing the same thing in regards to the internet. If you think about basically since DARPA in the early days, kind of basically internet version 1.0 or whatever, right? That was all about basically since having a network topology where everyone was just communicating loosely with each other, like your friends. But the more recent updates basically to the internet, which allows them to censor, is essentially kind of all about creating clearinghouses, which is then basically takes us straight to the World Economic Forum, kind of is talking about you needing an ID basically to access the internet, blah blah blah. But fundamentally, kind of basically, it is an imposed structure upon kind of basically a network topology, and I think it's fundamentally the same principle, kind of basically just in spiritualism, so to speak, kind of basically regards to Blavatsky. But I mean, some people kind of basically, but well, yeah, it's interesting you should bring up that quote because basically, if you read Albert Pike's Morals and Dogma and scroll pretty much to the end, it gives it away basically what a level 33, level 33 kind of basic degree basically is all about. It is basically someone who balances the in equilibrium, the spiritual with the material, the light with the dark, and so
Hmm.
forth. It's the guy basically who's sitting in the middle, balancing kind of basically the opposer versus the opposed, or oppressor versus
Right,
oppressed.
that's
Sorry, or basically it's basically the clearinghouse structure. Kind of
yeah.
basically it's describing that level 33 is the person who's sitting right in the middle, kind of basically on the expert panel, balancing these two forces, and that's basically the trick they played repeatedly. Kind of basically, kind of, and then you put the I said the Eric Dent's sort of university structure on top, and basically that's fundamentally it. Oh yeah, and then you dress it in subsidiarity rhetoric, kind of basically claiming that it's decentralized, basically when the
Yeah.
reality is centralized.
The decentralized gets me so upset because it is so deceptive and so many people are buying into it. So, what do you have any thoughts on how we can push back against all of this?
Yeah, I mean, basically, first off, kind of basically, we need to make sure, kind of basically, censor that they don't succeed, basically, in regards to kind of basic censorship, because basically, I think one of the things they badly misunderestimated, kind of basically, was people's willingness to have kind of basically their free speech confiscated. Because even a lot of people I know, kind of basically during COVID, basically or otherwise bought into kind of basically COVID, were absolutely vehemently against having, basically kind of like having a closed internet. I mean, they disagreed kind of basically all those people kind of basically conveying misinformation, but once you started basically talking about kind of basically they shouldn't be allowed to talk at all, kind of basically essentially be imprisoned for their thoughts, kind of basically essentially then only really a select few kind of basically agreed with it, and I think that's been basically a major stumbling block. I think fundamentally, kind of basically making sure that the information stays free, kind of basically is absolutely pivotal. The other sort of thing is basically kind of obviously digital ID because that narrows you down, that pigeonholes you kind of basically into the sort of global economy, basically, so to speak. And all this sort of is pushed through basically via commercial means, basically. If you speak up, kind of basically you'll be fired from your job and you can't feed your family and yada yada, right? It's all about kind of basically using money as a weapon, basically. Um,
Yes.
but um, but yeah, I mean, essentially, it's it's. I think they have some monumental battles coming up, and I think given how much they appear to accelerate certain things, like kind of basically was the head of the European Central Bank only a few days ago spoke about it's about time basically we start merging the entire eurozone into just one country. Kind of, I don't think people are ready for that. I think they're rushing this basically kind of because people are waking up, and I think it's one of those things kind of either delay it further, kind of basically, which will naturally wake people up, or they do it basically very quickly, in which case a large amount of people will probably speak up because it's just not right. They haven't been brainwashed into accepting this yet. So I think there are positives, kind of basically. Kind of, it's just finding kind of those positives and make sure you don't get blackpilled in the process, so to speak. You know.
Yeah, I think it's very important not to get blackpilled because people who are demoralized are not people who will take a stand. They're demoralized as a stage towards destabilization, and then they're really hopeless and useless. I think
You just you just sorry, kind of basically. I'm sorry for interrupting. Can you put up basically sense of that press release again, please?
Mhm.
Because basically, there was there was a story in the Telegraph today, basically saying which economy is going to go bankrupt first, basically France or Britain, right? Kind of basically, and both are obviously in serious financial sort of trouble. Yeah, basically, kind of now, what would happen in the event, kind of basically, center, say, for instance, Britain, kind of basically, kind of failed, went bankrupt, right? Is the center they would be put under kind of basically, kind of expert control. Basically, the IMF kind of basically would come in, or the Office of Budget Responsibility would sort of indirectly guide them in the right direction. Now, one of the documents I've strongly urged basically people to read, it's one of the most pivotal documents basically I've found, is a 2023 report by the Fabian Society called In Tandem. I wrote on this basically since a while back, kind of basically, and
In
it gives it all away, kind of basically, in
in
tandem, yeah.
and
So basically, yeah, if you go to my Substack, kind of basically since I've written about it, right, kind of, and basically what the document says is that kind of basically because of the lower bound, which effectively kind of basically with interest rates basically kind of they hit 0%, they cannot lower interest rate further, kind of basically, and in that particular situation, they need to start spending money, kind of basically as in public spending. Now, what they want to do is since they want to merge, basically kind of influence, or they want to create an EPCC, basically a committee, where an NGO and the Bank of England and the Treasury can sit and basically essentially kind of sit and discuss monetary and fiscal policy together, right? So they can coordinate all monetary and fiscal policy in tandem, right?
right,
What this will in effect do is essentially the monetary basically kind of policy will always be set at the Bank of England. Don't be under any illusion that they'll transfer anything. What this will in effect do is essentially that the public taxpayer, which is represented by the Treasury, will have to cede some authority kind of to the Bank of England kind of over fiscal policy. What that means is essentially kind of in the future, kind of should they have their way, it's not going to be basically your elected representative who's going to sit and dictate how much money you should pay in tax. It's the Bank of England and all the other technocratic organizations. And the document is incredibly detailed, basically, and really, really specific about this, that they want to take basically a do-good non-NGO, right, which is obviously going to be funded by basically a foundation. So, probably funded by the Bank of England through several intermediaries. And basically, they're gonna shift you kind of bit sort of saying, "Oh, we need to save the environment right now," and because of this kind of we need to have accommodative policy, which means basically your taxes needs to go up, and we need to spend all this money kind of basically on blended finance deals to save, I don't know, Peruvian rainforest, kind of basically who the hell knows, right? And it's going to be your taxes kind of basically sense of paying for this, and you can't even vote out the people who are doing it because it's the Bank of England and their cronies. It's just like it beggars belief, kind of basically publish this document. I strongly urge people to take that document and read it, or basically, I don't know, send it to ChatGPT, basically, since and ask pointed questions. But basically, that document tells you all about basically what they're aiming to do: transfer right over fiscal policy straight over to basically the central banks. It's just like, it's so undemocratic. How can anyone be all right with this? They,
right,
they always they always come up with, oh, it's only under exceptional circumstances, right? Okay,
of
and that
course,
part is true, right? But it's the Bank of England in control of monetary policies, so they can engineer those exceptional circumstances. That's not going to be difficult. Kind of be since the one in the government to collapse, raise interest rates. Yeah, basically since kind of reduce, kind of basically since kind of reduce outstanding kind of basic public debt. That will basically send it to you in a heartbeat. Kind of, it's all of a sudden the economy comes crashing down. Whoops, we need to have control over fiscal policy, and they're free to do whatever they want. It's a technocratic takeover, sure, basically, but effectively carried out basically with the central bankers right there in the middle.
right. What role do the technologies have in all this? I imagine Silicon Valley is very involved as well.
Well, they generate kind of basically all the surveillance equipment. They generate basically all the computational modeling, basically
Yep.
IASA, et cetera. Basically, so they're obviously involved. But I mean, essentially, I don't think a lot of people kind of just genuinely know what's truly going on. I mean, essentially, everything is just. I mean, you've been through this yourself, basically, but it's just essentially first time when you start reading United Nations documents, you don't really know what's going on because basically it feels like kind of basically this sounds good. It sounds good, right? Kind of basically, who doesn't want equitable distribution of resources? Kind of basically, who doesn't want marginalized women in Amazonas to have, I don't know, flat screen TVs, whatever, right? The point is just essentially kind of everything is just framed kind of basically as if kind of
For the
basically they're
greater
trying to do
good.
good.
Yeah.
Well, exactly. It's for the common good. It's for the
Yeah.
global good, but whatever, right? Kind of basically, it's all framed about basically being good for you, right? But the
Yes.
point is into once you start drilling into it and you start to understand kind of basically sense of what social justice really means, and social justice in this regard means kind of you can't really do anything in terms of social justice unless you know basically if society is unjust. In order to realize that society is unjust, you need to measure it, and that's
Yes.
basically what they call for global surveillance comes in, right? Now, once you got the global surveillance, kind of basically then you can model it at the IIASA, spit out kind of basically kind of like a target, kind of basically a correction in order to fix this, this inequitable distribution of resources. And anyone who disagrees with it, kind of basically essentially fundamentally is fundamentally against is unethical, basically, and a danger to our collective society. All that bullshit. Pardon my French.
Yes, yes. Well, it's appropriate.
Sustainable abundance.
It because it is. It's pure BS. It's all lies. I just don't know how we. Yeah, I'm very concerned about how we stop it. I agree with you on the censorship. People need to speak out in whatever capacity they can. So I think that that's definitely a bulwark. But beyond that, I don't know because once of these, the technologies are ramping up. So once they have,
Yeah.
right, that's the big difference between Technocracy Inc. in the 30s and where we are today. I really don't think the philosophy hasn't changed, the agenda hasn't changed, and really even a lot of the narratives haven't changed. It's really just the technologies that have changed, and that but the technologies are very advanced, and that's I don't know how we get around that.
I think I think kind of basically first off, kind of basically spreading the word, because you have to keep in mind that all this was brought through in the most
Yes,
opaque manner imaginable, right? And so, for instance, basically, kind of for a while back, kind of, you're sitting wondering how can people just casually come to accept this, right?
right.
Well, basically, because I found a document from 1949 about UNESCO and world citizenship, something along those lines.
Mhm.
And it describes essentially what they're going to do, basically in great detail. What they're going to do is essentially they're not going to educate the children basically about this. No, they're going to educate the teachers because the teachers will then basically become convinced of what they have to do because it's a basically moral drive and makes basically feel righteous.
Yes,
And consequently, during COVID, everyone was speaking up if you were not righteous, right?
right.
And the point is essentially about brainwashing the teachers first, right? Kind of basically, so they will subtly sow the seed of essentially this is what's right. And then a few years later, basically down the line, they will slowly kind of basically that information will seep into the young children. Then you can start updating the curricula, kind of basically since that's sort of the second stage. Once the curricula has been updated, then basically essentially kind of a few years down the line, then you can see it out basically essentially through the mainstream media, basically essentially in general information sort of streams kind of basically essential to the public at large. And it just slowly, just a little bit at a time, basically kind of against I mean, it's enormously clever, basically, I said, but it's just enormously deceitful.
Very. Yeah, I'm trying to look up I should know this, but what year was Robert Mueller's World Core Curriculum? Did you know? Is
I
that
forget, basically, I've read it a while back,
yeah,
and
I
it's
and I
3,000 ideas or whatever it was.
well, yeah, right. It was supposed to be 2,000 ideas. It became 7,000 ideas is what it became.
Yeah, yeah,
Um, because
yeah.
he was such a visionary that it became yeah, 7,000 ideas, but I don't know what year that was is what I'm looking up, but that was based on Alice Bailey's Education in New Age. So I mean all
Right.
of this, right? So it's all downstream from that. And if you look at the UNESCO mission statement from Julian Huxley, I mean, he says that it is eugenics. I mean, he literally says that it's a Malthusian worldview. So yeah, they're teaching them to teaching the teachers, and then downstream from that, absolutely. And
The,
yes,
o- the other sort of thing, the other sort of thing about basically this sort of the other sort of thing about basically this educating the teachers first.
mm-hmm,
It basically it removes you sort of not one link but two links of kind of basically the actual sort of. So if you want to basically since brainwash the world's population, kind of basically if you're just like putting in through the curriculum, then everyone will object to it, right? But basically, if you put it into kind of basically first sow the seed basically with the teachers, and then slowly bringing it that way, kind of basically everyone can sort of claim it had nothing to do with me, right? So you remove yourself basically since it kind of from you remove yourself kind of basically from the direct action, basically, but it does it sort of subversively, right? Now, first off, if you go to 1968 and look at the UNESCO Biosphere Conference, basically the what they propose to do in regards to basically filtering into education is practically the same kind of basic template. It's the same thing again, but it is fundamentally kind of basically a template which is much older because so I mentioned Alexander Bogdanov earlier, kind of basically was one of the most influential people basically in all this, sort of enormous intelligent. I strongly disagree with him in every regard, but basically since he was undoubtedly an incredibly intelligent man.
Who is this? I'm
He
sorry, I missed
speaks
the name.
uh, Alexander Bogdanov.
Oh, yeah,
He was
yeah,
the
for
father
sure. Yeah,
of technology and a
technology.
number of
Yep.
other things, but like yeah, and in 1920 he actually also came up basically with the Project Gaia theory. Kind of, I mean, essentially, but not only did he come up with the Gaia theory, kind of basically he actually said the circulating matter was carbon dioxide in 1920. It's just like like it just blows your mind sometimes to read of this sort of stuff. But one of the things Alexander Bogdanov was saying was basically kind of in order for us to get scientific socialism through, we're not going to change the matter itself, as in we're not going to change the science itself. What they're going to do is essentially they're going to change the methods of science, because that way, if you only teach kind of as children methods of science, which automatically leads to the right results, then that's all you have to do with time. Because then that way, kind of basically, people kind of basically sit at home, feel like this doesn't sound quite right. They'll go to the textbooks, kind of university textbook, whatever, and run through the equations, kind of basically, and there you go. It's like you've just confirmed it for yourself. And it's pretty simple, kind of basically in that regard. The way you do that is simply just by eliminating kind of basically any science or any message which doesn't conform to your preconceived sort of conclusion. And you see that the exact same thing kind of with regards to information and stuff like that. Anything kind of basically which leads to a wrong conclusion, any dissent to the IPCC reports kind of basically because they're different methods basis into kind of, basically, or just someone out there saying kind of basically Napier Stokes kind of basically at this ludicrous level kind of essentially is completely implausible. It's shut down and just ignored, kind of essentially kind of, in cold names and, certainly not invited kind of essentially to the IPCC reporting, you know, yeah, I'll point right in as well.
Yes, yes, I know full well. I'm working on my sixth YouTube channel, so I'm very familiar with this. Yeah, so
Very good.
yeah,
But so for instance, basically, kind of one of the things, kind of basically, which is interesting, right? So one of the future things which will be important is essentially is determining inequitable distribution of resources, kind of, intergenerational,
yeah,
intergenerational justice. Now, the entire concept is, of course, completely ludicrous because it summarized kind of basically all of humanity into a single number, kind of basically, which obviously isn't. But also, even if it could be summarized into one number, right, kind of basically, since you have genuinely no idea basically what your grandparents truly did, basically with their lives, and consequently, you cannot say basically just because they emitted carbon dioxide basically you should now be punished, which is fundamentally what this intergenerational equity or justice basically is all about, right? You're being punished for whatever your grandparents did, basically, go our list to have done. It's completely impossible to basically essentially calculate any of this. But now think about it strategically. Now imagine if you're one of the crooks and you wanted to make sure kind of basically this was useful to you in the future, what would you do? I'll tell you what you'd do. You'd write books and large sums of material about kind of basically how to determine what is equitable in a situation like that. Now, if you start looking into kind of basically the names of basically people who are basically doing this right now, you'll find some very interesting names.
for sure. Yeah, and we need to have counter resources, or also compile their resources so that you have proof
it,
track
it
record.
just needs it just needs to be exposed. Basically, I mean, this thing is so brittle, so fragile. It's kind of like you can look during COVID, right? Kind of it's during COVID. How quickly did they resort to censorship? It didn't
Yeah,
take long.
it was,
Exactly. Kind of that's how brittle it is. They literally relied kind of on outright censorship almost from minute one.
well,
It's
I don't know that it's just beating the censorship, because I feel like so many people are brainwashed to buy into the narrative. I mean, this is the problem that I come up against with constantly. That I'm just misinterpreting. My analysis is I don't understand them enough. This is the ultimate critical theory, right? Where we're just or the Neoplatonists was apoptosis, right? It's just negative theology. We're just going to critique you and critique you and critique you. You just haven't studied this enough. You don't understand it. Your analysis is therefore incorrect. But really, they just they're just trying to negate into oblivion because they don't want to look at the facts. But I find so many people are brainwashed, and so that really is a real issue to come up against, and that is not countered just by exposing, because then you get the people who are trying to poke holes in what should be obvious facts.
Yeah, but the thing is essentially, when you look at history as a whole, you don't need to reach 50% of the population to make the impact. You typically only need to reach basically a few percent. Once you've reached a few percent, you've fundamentally can't stop it.
Right.
Because the reason the reason why you're up against a large amount of people who've been brainwashed and their careers depend on believing
Sure.
a certain thing, yada yada, is because basically they've been around basically basically a large amount of people, basically essentially yada yada, who's been believing in a certain way their entire lives, which is fair enough, which is obviously very difficult to break through. I
Sure.
mean, during COVID, basically I had really highly intelligent friends basically refused to listen to basically basically when I said this doesn't make any sense, they just refused to listen to it. Now they were stand down the line, basically, so they're like, okay, all right, okay, this is definitely not quite right. And I don't know if you recall, but since in 2020 and 21, basically, when you're discussing on forums and television channels, whatever, based their, free comments sort of section and stuff like that. In 2021 and the first half of 2021, basically it was all like you're basically a heretic if you didn't buy into the obviously fraudulent narrative, right?
Right.
But basically around 2021, basically since that was taking a sharp turn, basically in my experience. And basically at that point in time, I said my Facebook account got banned around that time, basically because basically I just I went on these sort of forums basically and initially there were probably about 10 of us who countered basically the official narrative. Probably about 10 of us basically inside everyone else was completely on the opposite side. But just slowly, and I'm not taking credit for this, basically, I'm just saying that was the situation, right? Slowly but surely, just every other day, there would be just a few more people joining. And by the time basically my account got banned, since it probably about like 25% of all the comments had actually turned around and was starting to spot through this. So I'm not too worried about that since because yes, a lot of people will fight this. And basically, but at the same point in time, basically, a lot of people who people as a whole aren't unreasonable. Basically, one most people basically when they start to snap to the realization, basically, then this is not quite right. They, sort of, at least my experience, basically, since I'm not saying everyone, basically, but they will at least stop defending, until they fully understand the situation. So I'm not too worried about that. Basically, I said, if you look at history, since generally speaking, you just need a few percent who actually sort of like can exploit the truth, basically before it's game over, so to speak. And I think that is entirely credible and entirely likely, quite frankly, at this stage. I think basically the actions, basically, certainly by the central banks who are deeply, deeply in the middle of this, are speaking such loud sort of noises, basically, so that it seems like they're really, really worried about basically people waking up, and I think it's going to happen whether they like it or not. Now, if they're going to do anything crazy in the meantime, I can't say, and I'm not saying it's just central bankers. There are a lot of other people involved, of course, but I would be afraid of since a Western reply, since the most extreme kind in Ukraine, basically. I could see basically since someone pushing the red button just out of pure desperation. I don't think the battle is lost. Certainly, not. And I think yeah, I'm optimistic for the future. It's just a question of
Critical mass.
spotting the exactly, and also spotting the gaps basically because I think these people are, as said, I think these people are incredibly intelligent, right? Basically,
Yeah.
since without the shadow of a doubt, these people are highly intelligent.
Yes.
But they're not omnipotent, basically, and they have made some really, really bad mistakes along the way. And from my perspective, the single biggest mistake they have made is to base everything on pure logic. Because the entire structure they've erected basically over 200 years is entirely based on logic. And once you spot based sensor well, logically that would mean hex. You start looking basically in that direction, and basically before you know it, basically you become good at spotting it. That's fundamentally basically I've spoken to a number of people, basically, and it just takes that initial sort of like realization that's logically where does this lead, and basically once you realize that, and once of course it helps basically that really only do like 4 or 5 things repeatedly, just try to hide it kind of basically behind ever more complex terminology and Ethiopian language kind of basically. But yeah, it's we, we should stay optimistic because I do think we're going to beat them.
All right, well, I'm gonna hold on to that. So f the 4th thing, can you outline those again? Just to close out with that. Yeah.
It's well, a fourth thing kind of which was really just grabbed out of basically, but there's the clearinghouse structure, which is effectively kind of
Mhm.
basically sort of Hegelian dialects, where you splice kind of basically middleman into kind of any kind of power dynamic. Where like for instance, basically kind of you have the public and the private, basically mediated by the NGO sitting in the middle, kind of who's usually controlled by the way. But then you have the principle of subsidiarity, of course, kind of basically, which is effectively a manipulative way, kind of selling you basically a highly centralized concept, basically kind of as decentralized.
Yes.
Then there's basically since like the sort of Thomistic sort of system science um, sort of architecture, kind of is where the purposive leads to the normative, leads to the pragmatic, leads to the imperative. As in, we want to save the planet. Kind of is that means we need to instill this ethic. That means we need to create this organization in order to impact the people. It's basically sense of frameworks like that, but it's just applied continuously. It's always the same things. And then basically since the fourth thing is probably just the um, willingness and just curiosity kind of with regards to basically kind of how they very frequently take a topic. So for instance, if they try to pass basically a certain topic and it fails, then they'll take it and splinter it into small bits and pass them basically here and there and everywhere. And often kind of what they'll do is basically try to pass them in different precincts. And then basically down the line sort of saying, oh, Sweden came up with this brilliant idea. Why don't we try it here? And Bob's your uncle, or basically kind of oh, actually there's one more. So we spoke about subsidiarity, kind of, which we
Yeah.
also have regionalism, which
We
is
also have
which is
what?
a regionalism. So
Well, that's the whole multipolarity, right? The
yeah, it's basically it's pretty clever in itself, right? Kind of so for instance, basically kind of like say for instance, Germany kind of the politicians cannot push through a certain law. Basically, what they will then do is go through. They'll combine forces with French politicians, typical the socialist sort, and they'll create kind of basically an organization to solve some problem on behalf of both people. They'll come up basically with some ideas of how to solve this problem, which will strangely always basically arrive with an expert panel sitting mediating against kind of basically the various parties. And in the event this blows up, basically, since the German politicians and the French politicians will say, well, hang on, it wasn't my idea. It was just expert panels, basically, and they will just sort of drop the idea, cut it down into small bits, and then do the process again. It's
right.
it's it's
It's the
Rockefeller basically was very involved in this, basically in the already from 1920s onwards.
who was involved with this? Sorry.
The
Uh,
Rockefeller
oh, yeah,
Foundation
yeah.
funded kind of a lot
Well,
of this
it's
research.
sure. Yeah, I mean, it's a mafia structure, essentially. That's how the mafia operates, and it's the rings on rings kind of structure. So the Godfather doesn't do his own bidding, right? He's got his minions to do bidding for him. So,
Yeah,
yeah, yeah, essentially. So, all right. Well, I'm so grateful. Thank you for all your time. If you have anything else you want to
actually,
add, hmm
yeah, I just want to say the fifth thing, kind of basically, sense because it's really really important. Basically,
yeah,
kind of it
please.
is fundamentally, we hear a lot about basically this. They don't call them black boxes, basically, but that's what they are.
What
So, for
boxes?
instance, since a black box, right?
Sure.
A black
Yeah.
box. To say, for instance, you get all this surveillance information, you send it to the IIASA, basically, and they'll do their general systems theory modeling in order to forward predict. That process of doing forward prediction is essentially what a black box model is, right? You take data, you fuse it into a box, and it'll just come out with some information, right? Yeah. The key the key basis into the black box here is essentially kind of like is no one can be held responsible for this because the politicians basically kind of which will act on advice kind of which will say, well, it was the models. The modelers kind of which will say, yeah, well, it's not our fault. It was because we didn't have sufficient, basically, kind of like, sufficient amount of surveillance information. And the surveillance agencies said will come back and sort of say, well, that's because we didn't have sufficient funding. And then it goes back to politicians who say, no, that's fair enough. Here's some more money for basic surveillance. That's fundamentally kind of how the scam operates. No one kind of essentially can take the responsibility for anything, kind of basically, certainly not the expert panels, certainly not the politicians, not the modelers, no one. And ultimately, kind of basically, ultimately what they really do is that they diffuse responsibility. kind of basically sense no one will hold the back, which is perfect from that perspective because they can still get the black box models. They'll just run the black box model 2,000 times with slightly different parameters in order to get the correct results. And then
Right.
that's going to be claimed to be the best science available. Kind of basically from that, you'll just take the best science available and convert it into an ethical imperative. And there you go.
Yeah. It's
Yeah,
an advanced version of the Delphi method, essentially.
yeah. It's fraud.
Oh,
It's just
yeah, fraud. Right, that would be the simple way to explain it. I guess one other thing before we, close out, just because, so much of this is predicated on system theory and, which, it's these, it's this predictive modeling, but then derived from that, is complexity theory, and I'd love if you could touch on that a little bit too, because that's where they predict the emergence that comes out of these predictive modeling, so.
um, I'd rather not.
Oh, okay.
I'd rather not because basically I've had these conversations so many times,
Oh,
and
okay.
it becomes sort of a question of essentially kind of who cites what source. It's fundamentally kind of like if you really seek to simplify it, kind of basically kind of one of the fundamental problems kind of basically kind of with a hierarchical architecture, kind of basically general systems theory or the likes, is that essentially kind of you have loops and you have kind of basically interacting sort of compounds, which means basically essentially the model itself kind of basically will with time change. And it becomes basically essentially, yeah, no, I'm not I'm not gonna go into basically kind of about like best of luck kind of basically with
It what?
your investigations. Best of luck with your investigations. It's from our perspective, kind of basically essentially you don't really need that in order to address the core component anymore.
Sure, well, I
It's
mean,
it's
what were you
it's sufficient to from my perspective, it's essentially kind of it's sufficient to understand kind of basically that the what they're trying to push through is Spaceship Earth. Spaceship Earth is fundamentally kind of like a closed system model, kind of basically a closed general systems theory model of the entire planet.
Mhm,
And basically, kind of like in order to produce that, you need basically essentially kind of huge amounts of global surveillance. You need basically kind of models in order to forward predict kind of basically sense of where material goes, as in the circular economy. And then basically essentially you need sort of way basically sense to measure kind of basically the circular health as well, which is effectively kind of basically biodiversity, kind of how well that's doing. And then essentially the active sort of instruments in order to address basically any potential issues. You got basically One Health, which is ultimately about control basically of biodiversity, and you got the ecosystem approach, which is basically the primary instrument of the Convention of Biological Diversity, which is about a biosphere administration, integrated landscape management, they call it. It's effectively top-down kind of basic control over kind of basically kind of every corner of the planet, which is basically what UN Habitat basically was talking about in 1976.
right.
And yeah, it's
No
yeah.
problem. We won't go there. I just think complexity theory is a way that they can kind of delude people into thinking that it's a grassroots and it's an organic emergence versus the predictive modeling where they're steering.
Okay, no, I found okay. Basically, I thought you were going to take it basically kind of down the other sort of side. Yeah, you're probably right about that. I must admit, basically, I haven't looked terribly much into that, basically. But yes, it's yeah.
Yeah, that's my, assessment of it, but yeah. Well, I'm so grateful, thank you. I'm grateful for all the work you've done, I'm grateful for, the research that you've delved into and, that you've made available to everybody, and for giving us all this time today. If you have anything else you want to close out with, please do. Of course, tell everybody where they can find you and anything else. Yeah.
Yeah, no, escapekey.substack.com basically essentially is my primary it's my primary platform for the time being. Anyway, kind of basically said it's good for the time being because essentially you can control P, save anything kind of to a PDF, and in the event kind of you disappear tomorrow, kind of basically it's not really a big deal because you've got all your stuff backed up, as opposed to Twitter, which doesn't back up even when you ask for it.
And shadow bans you from finding even your own material, so
Yes, yes,
yes.
unbelievable.
Yes, agreed.
Right, well, thank you very much. Then I will say in return, and yeah, let's go battle the evil spirits together.
Yes, likewise. Yes, hopefully together we will build the critical mass that is needed to rise up and really preserve for the free will of humanity, because that's what I believe is in jeopardy. So yeah.
Yeah,
Well,
very good. Thank you very much.
thank you, and thank you all for watching and listening.